this special event, Policy Conversation, and the book presentation by Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in partnership with Agora Policy. It is such a wonderful moment for us to gather here this morning. Thank you, Your Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, for accepting the invitation and taking time out of your busy schedule to be here today. As we begin, allow me to extend our warmest greetings to our eminent speakers and distinguished guests. His Excellency, the Executive Governor, Anambra State, Professor Charles Chukwuma Soludo, CFR, who joins us virtually. He's a round of applause for His Excellency, the Executive Governor, Cabinet State, Manon Nasser El Rufai, who's here. Please allow me to applause. Distinguished senators and honorable members of the House of Representatives here present, special advisors to the President here present, His Excellency former ministers here present, retired Justice Mirul El Mohammed here present. Please a round of applause for her. Mr. Aigboji Aiki, founder and chairman of Coronation Capital, co-founder and chairman of Aiki Mokwede Foundation. Please a round of applause. Dr. Shiban Shaduri, country director of the World Bank. A round of applause for him. Dr. Zainab Usman, director of the Africa Program, Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and the author of the book, Diversification in Nigeria, the Politics of Building a Post-Oil Economy. These are the sounding words of the Clifton Map. Founder and Executive Director, Agora Policy, Mr. Waziri Adil. I thought I was getting here. Members of the Diplomatic Corps, Excellencies, High Commissioners, and Ambassadors here present, private sector executives and stakeholders, development partners, civil society organizations, gentlemen of the press, ladies and gentlemen, a very good morning to you all. But just before I will move ahead, let also quickly recognize His Highness Khalifa Muhammad Sanusi II. How can I forget that? I am Maxine Nadia and I am honored to serve as the anchor for this event. This event is carefully curated by Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and Agora Policy with the theme, how Nigeria can build the post-oil economic future. What we will have in common in this room is at one time or the other, a lot of us here have been involved in that conversation. A lot of us here have been involved in creating policies to engender growth and development in Nigeria. Nigeria, with her numerous human, natural, mineral resources, continue to live. Even as the largest economy and most populous country in Africa. The story of Nigeria so far is showing us that being bigger is not always better. What has caused Nigeria's underperformance? How did power, politics, and decision-making impact the trajectory of Nigeria's development? Some people are quick to say that Nigeria is peculiar. I hear that a lot. When I interview a lot of people, oh, Nigeria is peculiar. Things that happen elsewhere cannot happen here. Why is Nigeria peculiar? What is peculiar about us? Is it our people? Is it our language? Perhaps. Is it also the way we speak English? An English person will say, let me take for example, will say extreme. An American will say end. The Nigerian will say extreme end. A Briton will say nika. An American says shorts. A Nigerian will say short knicker. A British man will say so. An American will say therefore. A Nigerian will say so therefore. An English person will say salon. An American will say barbershop. A Nigerian will say barber salon. An Englishman will say £10. An American will say $10 each, £10 each. A Nigerian will say 10 naira. 10 naira, 10 naira. Perhaps I can all see where the problem started. First, I would like to invite, as we proceed with this event and host for today, the man whom you all have honored with your presence, the immediate past executive secretary of Nigeria Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, author of the Act of the Possible, and chaplain Agora policy, Mr. Waziri Ajib, for his welcome remarks. Please give them a big round of applause.
Thank you so much, Chief. Nice Madi. She's actually a chief and proper chief. Please, Your Excellencies, Your Eminences, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, please kindly permit me to stand on the existing protocol. My job here is very simple. So on behalf of the Africa program of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and Agora Policy, I warmly welcome you to this joint and two-party event. We're honored by and grateful for your esteemed presence. Thank you. As part of this welcome, please permit me to quickly do 3 things. The first is to briefly introduce the hosts of this event. Carnegie Endowment for International Peace needs no introduction to this distinguished audience or to any audience anywhere else in the world. But suffice it to say that Carnegie is one of the oldest and one of the most respected think tanks in the world today. As you know, it was founded in 1910, as 133 years ago, in my math records one. In 2021, as in many other years, Carnegie was ranked the #1 think tank in the biennial Global Go-To Think Tank Index, published by the Think Tanks and Civil Society Program of the University of Pennsylvania. On its part, Agora policy is as new can be. I have the solid honor of being its founder. I started Agora policy about a year ago, shortly after a 5-year stint in government. And based on the firm conviction that Nigeria needs its own version of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, the Brookings Institution, the Chatham House, and a host of other institutions that have existed for decades, for generations, for centuries, even, and have consistently and studiously served as wellsprings, incubators, and warehouses of policy ideas that have transformed their immediate societies and the world at large. At Agora Policy, we're young in age, but aged aspiration. But I come across the many policy offerings that we have been relentlessly and relentlessly dishing out in the past few months. The policy reports, the policy insights, the policy memos, and more. By the way, there's a joke that one of the WhatsApp groups that I belong to. So some of you might know this artist called Asake. And almost every 2 weeks or so, Asake, will come up with a link by that, so to say. And somebody tweeted, Asake, calm down. Is it that you're owing somebody? Do we need to process money for you to pay off whatever you're owing? Somebody also said, Mr. Agora, what is going on? All these things that you are turning up week in, week out. Is there anybody that we need to to make it to come down. We are decidedly evidence-led and solution-driven, and we are committed to joining others in finding practical solutions to Nigeria's urgent national challenges. We focus on research, dialogue, and capacity building. It is still very early days yet, but we are grateful to Mercator Foundation for the early support and affirmation in us. To our supremely talented resource persons, some of them are here, and to our esteemed colleagues in civil society and the media space for their invaluable support. And we are honored within these 30 days also to be invited by Carnegie to host this event. Thank you very much. My second task is to also briefly introduce today's event. As I mentioned earlier, we're here to do two things. One, to present to the Nigerian policy elite the remarkable book by our sister, Dr. Zainab Usman, the pioneer director of Carnegie Africa Program. By the way, the Carnegie Africa Program started about 2 years ago, and she happens to be the pioneer director. And she's been running all this faster than our secretary said. So please, kudos for that. Zainab's book is a very important one, and please pardon me if I won't say so. And she deserves all the accolades that she has been getting. On your behalf, Zainab, on behalf of everyone, I congratulate Zainab for the book and for the other strides she's been making. Let me also congratulate our parents, Justice Mairo L. Mohammed, retired, and our dads. This is the joy of every parent. He wants a situation like this where not just that your daughter has gone to the best schools in the world, has worked in the best institutions in the world, but has also done a book that is voted by the Financial Friends of London, one of the best books in economics for 2022. So thank you for that. So this book will serve as an entry point for the important discussion today by our eminent analysts. They are there, and other distinguished members of the audience. I want to make this as interactive as possible. We hear from the panelists, and we also have contributions from the floor, and also questions and answers. My third task today is to again briefly attempt to set the stage, to frame, if you will, our deliberation here today. And here too, I will make 3 short and obvious points. The first point is that Nigeria's economic performance has been uneven and below par. Zainab made that point, many other people have also made that point. So much has been written about this and the reasons for the undesirable outcome. The Nigerian condition has been well documented and well theorized. But Nigeria's uneven and subpar economic performance is not just about theoretical constructs or frameworks, or just a mere academic exercise, or just a set of raw or stylized data. It's about lives, lived and unlived. It has flesh and blood implications for all of us, especially for most of our citizens. And it has political, social, security, and security dimensions that reverberate within and beyond our borders. The second point I want to make is that development, the sustainable variant, is not a naturally occurring phenomenon. It is created. It is not just about plans beautifully and periodically drawn up, but more about carefully considered choices. The one by mind there, the others talking about choices, and consistently applied actions by political and policy elites. Development is deliberate. The third point I want to make is that the different development paths, the third point I want to make is that a different development path is not just desirable for Nigeria, it's necessary, it is urgent, it is existential. And there can be no better time than now to start that deliberate journey of not just thinking differently, but acting differently, and most importantly, optimally and consistently. I personally look forward to an engaging and solution-centered deliberation today. There's a philosopher that most people here conversant with, but who will remain on date. And he said something, one of the most memorable lines, that the philosophers and historians near the various ways explained the word. The point is to change it. So please, one of the things I hope we're going to do here today is that we go beyond the usual just causing the dark and more about problems. We start talking about concrete solutions and pathways to Nigeria's progress. Again, on behalf of Carnegie and Agora Policy, I'm extremely honored to welcome you once again. Thank you and God bless.
Please, can we leave the applause and greet louder than that? Thank you very much, Mr. Yar'Adua, for that welcome remark. Let's quickly do a few recognitions. Immediate past Governor of Ekiti State, Dr. Kayode Fayemi, is a round of applause. We also have here Mr. Basuki Arabi, who is the Director General of the Bureau of Public Service Reforms, EPSR. Thank you very much. Without much ado, we just have to move ahead because I know that we started this event a bit late. We were supposed to be here for a bit less than 3 hours, so we'll try as much as possible to get the event going. Today's event, like I mentioned at the beginning, was a 2-in-1 event, like they say in marketing. Buy one, get one free. It's a quality conversation. It's also a book presentation. Our next speaker lives to do. She lives to write. She thinks economic and public policy. Her latest book, Economic Diversification in Nigeria, The Politics of Building a was chosen as one of the best books of 2022 on e-commerce by the Financial Times, just like Mr. Yar'Adua mentioned. She was part of a prestigious Young Professionals program of the World Bank. She is a public sector specialist. She has utilized her skills and worked on different issues such as policy reforms, social sustainability, natural resources management, disruptive technologies in countries like Cote d'Ivoire, Uzbekistan, Republic of Congo, Tanzania, Serbia, to mention a few, and also consulted for the Department of International and Development, DFI. She had worked at the Blavaltic School of Government at the University of Oxford, where she also earned her doctorate. She is the co-editor of the book, The Future of Work. I've read that book for 80 years. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to introduce the remarkable author of the book Economic Diversification in Nigeria, The Politics of Building a Post-War Economy. Please welcome, with a resounding round of applause, the Senior Fellow and Director of the Africa Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington, D.C., Dr. Zainab Usman.
I want to be biased to you that communities to the honor and return to the roots.
You're too kind, Nancy. We were reading out all of those descriptions. To be honest, I wasn't sure you were disturbing me. I just remember spending long nights, early mornings and weekends working on this book. So it's really an honor to have all of you join us today. And I'm very, very honored. I'm very, very delighted. It's a Tuesday morning and you left your busy lives to come here and participate in this important policy discussion. All protocols duly observed. Your Excellencies, your Highnesses, your Majesties, esteemed guests, distinguished panelists, thank you very, very much. What I'm going to do over the next 30 minutes is just to walk you through some highlights of the book. This is by no means going to be a presentation of the summary. It's really just to highlight a couple of hopefully important messages that can spark an even more important conversation. How do I look with slides? With a handsome slide.
Sorry.
Okay, it's on. So that presentation directly draws on the title of the book. Next slide, please. I divided the presentation into 4 parts. I'll give you a bit of background to explain why I decided to focus on this topic. And then I'll go over a couple of key messages. And then I'll outline some conclusions. But then there's also an addendum, something that I thought about a few days ago and I added to this presentation. And then hopefully you can have a more robust discussion. Next slide, please. The background. What problems is this book trying to address? Why now? And why is this important? Next slide. I thought to go over some basic facts that we all know about Nigeria. It's Africa's most populous country with a population of, well, we don't really know. So we need to do a census on that. But maybe somewhere in the region of 200 million people. It is also Africa's largest economy, but it's undergone a recession, actually 2 recessions in the last couple of years, but it is now recovering in terms of the growth of the economy. It is also a very entrepreneurial country, and I've worked in a number of African countries, in fact, a number of other countries around the world. And it's really striking to me how entrepreneurial Nigerians are. According to a recent government survey, there are over 44 million micro, small, and medium-scale enterprises. There are also, of course, large conglomerates. We have the photo of Aliko Mbuti there, as in a sense, an illustration of really what is possible in terms of the large enterprises. Nigeria also has a very dynamic, creative population, especially among these small and medium-scale enterprises, which is why the country has the world's 2nd largest film industry, if you measure that by output. So it comes right behind Bollywood in India. But there are also other creative industries, the arts, music, etc. And then finally, and I left that for last, but I suppose it's one of the reasons why we're here today, Nigeria is Africa's largest oil producer. It produces somewhere in the region of 1.4 million barrels a day of oil, which is actually much less than the country used to produce in the early 2000s at around, I think, 2.4 million barrels a day. And it's much less than what the country is aspiring to get to become some production at around 4 million barrels a day. And in fact, if you do the calculation in terms of total outputs, Nigeria today is around number 13 when it comes to oil producers, down from around between number 7 and number 10 in the early 2000s. And I will get to that in a bit. Next slide. So what is this book about and why? Why focus on this topic? It is actually a decade-long inquiry from my own end, personally, but also professionally, into the development challenges that oil-rich and resource-rich countries like Nigeria face. And it's so interesting that, over the course of doing this research, when I was a doctorate student, down to my time at the World Bank, to, concluding the book while I was at Carnegie, across all those phases of my life, I met quite a number of people from other oil-rich and resource-rich countries. I had friends from Algeria, Mexico, a number of other countries. It's a question that tends to obsess people like us that come from resource-rich countries. Why does a country have so much natural resources, but it just doesn't seem to do very well? And there are countries that have done well. There are those that have had middling levels of performance. And there are those that, like Nigeria, that could have done much, much better.
So I couldn't really see the slide here. Wait. So that a key question that I started out with is, what is the reason for the underperformance of the Nigerian economy? And I use underperformance here for a reason I'll get to it in a bit. What role does Nigeria's resources, especially its oil wealth, play in this economic underperformance? And is there any role that politics play? Politics, power, decision-making in all of this configuration? So these are really the three questions that I started out with. Next slide, please. Which then brings me to the key messages, and there are 9 that I'm going to talk about very quickly today. Next slide. So the first message is that, look, if you have a problem, what is the first step to addressing the problem? We have to accurately identify and diagnose that problem. And in the course of doing that, I started out with the prevailing explanations for why countries like Nigeria are where they are. And it occurred to me then that we actually need an alternative way of thinking about the problem, an alternative framework for conceptualizing the challenges of oil-rich countries like Nigeria. And there are prevailing explanations, right, that they tend to attribute this failure, these challenges to the fact that there are certain inherent characteristics in these countries that prevent them from achieving their true potential. I want to summarize 2 of those prevailing theories. The first is the idea of there's an oil curse. If you have oil wealth, of course, you're going to have economic stagnation, corruption, bad governance, and conflict. And indeed, you see elements of all of those things there. But it is not just the oil wealth that is causing these challenges. And there are countries that are rich with oil and other natural resources that do not experience similar levels of certain types of dysfunction that we see in Nigeria. So that's the first set of theories that we really need to set aside. The second is the idea of a culture. And, this is a bit of an academic jargon, so forgive me for that. But it's called neo-patrimonialism, a neo-patrimonial culture that in countries like Nigeria, you tend to have a fusion of traditional and modern institutions that result in governance arrangements that are so distorted and so dysfunctional that they are unable to facilitate economic development and economic transformation. And in a sense, yes, you can see some of those dysfunctions, whether it's at the level of the local government, in some states, at certain federal institutions, you see some of those, but there are also positive deviances. There are cases in which reforms have happened, federal agencies have been run properly, etc. So that cannot be the sum total of the explanation. That is another set of theories that we need to set aside. Next slide, please. So if these prevailing explanations are not good enough, they don't really help us really diagnose and understand the challenges of economic development in a country like Nigeria, what framework should we use? And my argument, this is not just a new argument from me, there's actually a growing body of academic literature on this, is that it is actually a country's political settlement that shapes policy making and then affects economic outcomes. And let me try to break this down a bit. So in the case of Nigeria, the central challenge of economic development is the country needs to I actually can't see. Yeah, so I'm going to stand here. It is the country's central development challenge is the diversification and transformation of the economy. And this challenge lies at the intersection of politics and policy making. And you could say, yeah, well, but that's obvious. It is, but sometimes that's not how it's conceptualized. So you need to really be able to identify what the problem is. But then we get to the factors causing the problem or underlying the problem. And this is where we get to the political settlement. It is actually an unstable political settlement or an unstable distribution of political power among groups, among individuals in Nigeria. We can get to that in a bit more detail. That causes Nigeria's leaders to be in a perpetual state of crisis management. And this is not something that
I'm pinning on any one administration or one person. No, it's something that has had remarkable historical consistency throughout the country's history. In this state of crisis management, the focus tends to be on reforms that are easier to do. They're not easy reforms, but they're easier to do. Macroeconomic stabilization, restoration of growth, selective public sector reforms, tax reforms. Those are things that when you're really, really desperate, you have to do them. They're easier to do than the systemic structural reforms that tend to be more difficult around the world. Land reforms, agriculture, civil service reforms. Those have not happened. Those are things that Nigeria has struggled with, even in the best of times. So as I mentioned, this has had remarkable historical consistency throughout Nigeria's history, regardless of regime type, whether it's military rulers or elected civilian governments as we've had over the past 20 years. Next slide, please. So I want to zoom in on what I mean by crisis management. This crisis management mode that prevents systemic long-term thinking around the difficult structural reforms. In the 1990s, Nigeria experienced what is called a lost decade of growth. And as you can see on the chart on the right-hand side of the slide, it starts actually from the year 1991. Growth at the time between 1991 until around 2000 averaged around, I think it was 1 or 2%. It was actually way below population growth, which is the flat line in green. Nigeria experienced a lost decade of growth at the time, and a lot of us remember the 1990s, they were very difficult. But then following the transition to democratic rule, there were reforms that started to happen. The balance of power became a bit more stable. And again, it's something we can discuss in a bit more detail, what I mean by balance of power. It became a bit more stable until around the year 2010. And at the time, growth recovered. And you can see the blue line on the chart on the right-hand side of the slide, growth shot up. It actually averaged around 7% per annum until around 2010. And from 2010 to 2014, 2015, it averaged around 5% per annum. So what you find is, you can plot this graph across Nigeria's entire history, that there are these growth spurts that tend to happen, but they never extend beyond 5-7 years, right? So Nigeria's economy can grow, and it tends to grow during periods of relative political stability, when meaningful reforms are actually implemented and national projects are pursued. Next slide, please. So here is where it gets very, very interesting. Even when policy reforms are implemented in a best case scenario in Nigeria, they are only able to drive growth for a certain period of time before that sputters, right? So when policy reforms happened in the early 2000s, and there are actually quite a number of people in this room that were part of that process, so maybe we'll hear from them. Growth at the time in the early 2000s was actually driven by non-oil sectors. If you do a rough, and this is just a rough decomposition of growth over that period from around 1999 until around the year 2019. Growth was largely driven by the non-oil sectors, as you can see on the left-hand side of the slide, while the oil sector itself, for actually nearly 2 decades, has been consistently recording negative growth. I just mentioned to you that oil output today is just at around 1.4 million barrels a day, down from around 2.2 or 2.4 million barrels a day in the early 2000s. So in sectors where we saw policy reforms, whether it's banking and finance, the liberalization of banking and finance, ICT, a bit of trade, and I will come to trade in a bit. I probably shouldn't have included trade there. Industries generally, where the easier to do reforms were implemented, they were able to help drive growth. So the chart on the right-hand side of the slide shows that during this period, the share of oil in national GDP actually declined. right? So you can see oil is the area shaded in dark brown. It declined from around 50% share of GDP in the year 2000 to around, roughly around 10, 11% that it is today. It fluctuates a bit, but it's roughly around 10%. So we've seen an actual, change in the Nigerian economy in terms of the gross domestic product. Next slide, please. But these changes that we've seen over the past 20 years in the Nigerian economy have actually not diversified Nigeria's exports and fiscal revenues. And this is really the crux of the matter, that Nigeria's exports are still overwhelmingly concentrated around the oil industry. It accounts for more than 80% of export earnings, as you can see on the chart on the left-hand side of the slide. The area shaded in green represents oil. The area shaded in blue represents non-oil exports. Same thing with government revenues. We've seen, as a little bit of a rebalancing in that mix, but oil revenues account for still around 50% of government revenues. So which is why whenever there is some kind of volatility in global oil prices, everyone feels it. But people are not engaged in the oil sector. Most people don't work there, but people feel it through the mechanism of exports and government revenues. Next slide, please. Bringing me to my sixth message, and this is a fairly obvious point, but I think it's worth restating. This dependence on oil revenues is even more acute at the subnational level, the level of states in Nigeria, the 36 states. When I did this analysis, this was figures from the year 2018, but it broadly holds true with a few changes and variations here and there. And basically what it shows you is that only 2 states, maybe 3 or 4 maximum, are able to generate their state revenues from internal sources. Most of Nigeria's other states, so we're talking about, 32, 33, 34 states, overwhelmingly depend on oil revenue transfers, federal oil revenue transfers, north, south, east, west. The role of Nigeria's states is so crucial, and I worry that this is still a point that is underappreciated even among Nigerians, because it is at this level that people feel the impact of government. It is at this level that you're going to have some of the policy reforms that can facilitate growth and drive what economists call structural transformation. But there's a lot of work to do with respect to Nigeria's states. And the chart I have on the right-hand side of the slide, what I did was, this was in the year 2013, during the peak of the oil boom for Nigeria. There was another oil boom recently, but I don't think it was an oil boom globally, but it was not necessarily an oil boom for Nigeria. So I think 2013 is probably the peak for Nigeria. And at the time, the budgets of some Nigerian states actually exceeded the GDPs of some African countries, from Cabo Verde to Central African Republic to the Seychelles, Comoros. So these states are very, very important, right? And we'll come back to this in a bit, but I thought to present this snapshot. Next slide, please. So what I also do in the book is I then zoom in on 2 states in Nigeria, Lagos and Kano. In the case of Lagos, it has been able to, on some measures, because I know there are people from Lagos who are gonna fight me after this event, based on what I'm gonna say now, but on some measures like fiscal revenues, Lagos has been able to achieve some results that we've not seen in other states in the country. It's been able to achieve some level of diversification of its fiscal revenues. Of course, this is Nigeria's commercial capital. Some would say it had an early head start. It had all this federal infrastructure, et cetera, its endowment structure, large concentration of human capital, all of that. But it has been able to achieve some results, and we cannot ignore that. What you see on the chart on the upper right-hand side of the slide is that Lagos has been able to rebalance its state revenues right? From a situation to a situation where just about 20% now come from federal transfers, and more than 80% come from internal sources, of course, including some borrowing here and there. This fiscal diversification, as I call it, is actually not random. It didn't just happen. It's the result of deliberate policy reforms that happened in the 2000s. And this is where, we get to the political analysis. Ruling elites in Lagos became reform-oriented because they faced certain kinds of pressures. What are those pressures? And, there are a multitude, but I want to mention a few here. The population explosion that happened in Lagos and still happening today. People love to move to Lagos. It's the city of opportunity. Rural, urban migration happens. What is it? The city's population is 20 million or something. But there was also urban decay at the time. The municipal infrastructure was terrible. I spent a couple of months talking to people in Lagos for this research, and people were telling me that at the time, the city was basically disappearing under a mountain of rubbish. You couldn't even move from point A to point B, right? There was violent crime, and then the intergovernmental tensions between the federal government and Lagos. All of these combined to pressure elites to think outside the box, to implement tax and public financial management reforms, to generate new sources of revenues, to run the country, to run the state, but yeah, maybe to do other stuff too, I don't know. So basically, I think what I'm trying to say here is that, there are also other people who have written papers about the reform episode in Lagos. They were able to build a political coalition to envision some kind of a different approach to running Lagos to generate more revenues, right? Maybe we did not quite see reforms resulting in structural transformation, but there was some movement. There was a reform orientation at the time. Next slide, please. Now we come to Kano, which is the second state that I looked at and I focus on in the book. Kano, as you know, is another major economic hub in Nigeria. It's perhaps the largest it's perhaps the anchor of the economy of northern Nigeria. Kano, unfortunately, has been a microcosm, an illustration of Nigeria's failed industrialization. Let me explain what I mean by that. Kano has struggled in the sectors, agro-allied sectors that economists, social scientists would argue were decimated by globalization over the past 3 decades. Sectors, whether it's in food processing, but in particular the cotton, textiles, and garment sectors, where those were badly hit when China joined the World Trade Organization in the 2000s. So local production could really not compete with cheaper subsidized imports. But I think this is only part of the story. Because Kano has tremendous, it has a large population, something in the region of maybe 12 to 15 million people. I don't know, we need to do a census. It has a very entrepreneurial culture that dates back to the pre-colonial era. It has a very interesting endowment structure, arable land, other types of resources. So this, the globalization argument is really no excuse. Besides, we've seen countries like Kenya, Ethiopia, etc., build special economic zones and were able to attract FDI around cotton, textiles, and garments for exports. We'll get to that in a bit. But my argument is that it is actually, this is also not random, that it is the nature of the political settlement in Kano that has made policymakers unable to reimagine a new growth agenda for the state that harnesses the region's comparative advantage, not only in the agro-industrial activities that we mentioned, but also to support new industries like Kannywood. And in the book, at the beginning, I actually talk about Kannywood and certain incidents that happened, and maybe we can talk about that in the Q&A session. There were some limited efforts over like a 5-year period to improve public financial management, to do some tax reforms, but those had a barely marginal impact, as you can see on the upper right-hand side of the slide. So basically, there has been an absence of and again, this is not to blame anyone, it's fairly consistent. The absence of a consistently pro-business leadership. And again, I spent weeks in Kano talking to entrepreneurs, industrialists, the business associations, and across the board, this was what they said. The leadership, they just have a very tricky relationship, right? It's not antagonistic, it's not entirely supportive. So this has actually been to the detriment of Kano. And again, if we look at the comparative historical literature, whether it's from East Asia, other parts of the world, there has to be a very kind of dynamic complementary state-business relationship, and we've not necessarily seen that in Kano. We've seen elements of it in Lagos, we've not seen that in Kano. Next slide, please. So to put all of these together, get into my ninth and final point, Nigeria is neither a failed state, nor is it a developmental state. And let me explain that in a bit more detail. It is not a failed state that is doomed to perpetual economic stagnation, because reform episodes do happen. They can happen for 5 years, 7 years, even up to 10 years. It happened in the 1960s until the breakout of the Civil War, then in the 1970s for another decade, then in the early 2000s, and then we are where we are today. But it is also not a developmental state. And again, this is one of those academic jargons. In the literature, a developmental state is used to refer to a state that enables structural economic transformation. These are states that you see, and I think the term was coined when used to describe the East Asian tigers in the 80s and the 90s, South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, most recently China, definitely not in that mold. But Nigeria is probably an intermediate state. This is a term coined by Peter Evans. And it's very interesting, when he coined the term in the 1990s, he used it to refer to Brazil and India. So it's a country is capable of episodic reforms, 3 years, 5 years, 7 years, that can produce some spurts, some episodes of growth. But in its current configuration, it's very difficult to see policy reforms happening that can transform and diversify the economy due to the underlying political settlement. Therefore, policymakers, in the best of times, tend to be constrained to short-term stabilization policies, because you need to stabilize the economy, you need to restore growth, you need to generate new sources of revenues, you need to do some tax reforms. And these can drive sporadic growth. But the difficult transformational policies, structural transformational policies that can, in the long term, increase productivity, and then get us to diversifying our economy and having competitive exports, those are things that Nigeria has struggled with, right? On the supply side, thinking about infrastructure, the past 20, how many years, where is the infrastructure in Nigeria? The trains connecting the whole country. Electricity, I'm here with my colleagues from the US, and when they experienced the first power outage, they were a bit agitated. But this is it, this is something that has not changed in Nigeria. Why? Electricity. I just came back from Kenya. At least in the capital city, in the major cities, you don't experience a power outage. Why has Nigeria struggled with that? Petroleum sector deregulation, subsidies, the endless debate. I can remember, right from the 1990s, every government has promised to try to remove subsidies. It's so difficult. Chapter 6 of the book talks about the structural reasons why it's so difficult to remove subsidies. There's no public mass transit system, right? So there's some limited inflationary impact there, and people will rise up and get angry, but why haven't those things been fixed? On the demand side, implementing social protection policies, when I was at the World Bank, one of the analytical pieces we did was actually on social protection. And that was when I realized that actually Nigeria lags behind even other African countries in the provision of social protection, social assistance, social transfers, behind countries like Ethiopia, Ghana, Kenya, Senegal. Then civil service reforms. No country transforms without an effective civil service that is dynamic, that is competent. This is something that Nigeria has struggled with. Every government talks about reforming the civil service. It never works, right? So these are the kinds of difficult things that you need to do. If you look at the history of countries that have made the transition from poverty to prosperity, they have to do these things and more. But these are things that Nigeria has struggled with. But, you can see tax reforms will happen, transparency in public financial management, that will happen, but that's not enough. Next slide, please. So it brings me to my key conclusions, and I conclude the book on 5 points. I'm going to mention them very quickly. So the first is, and I want to step back a bit here and mention that in the course of this research, I had to try to find out, to the best of my ability, what the countries that have been able to make that transition, what they did well, how they framed their challenge. Of course, there's the economic and technical dimension. There's also the kind of sociological dimension in terms of how policymakers, policy elites think about the country, its underlying philosophy, and its future. And one thing that struck me consistently is that when a country has leaders that want to move that country to a new phase of income and development, they conceptualize that process. It's a political project. Nobody thinks of, we want to industrialize our economy because it's nice to industrialize. Industrialization is actually very difficult. You do it for a political reason, and oftentimes it's an existential political reason for survival. You think about South Korea. When they started to industrialize, it was really to be able to fortify themselves against North Korea and to an extent China. You think about Singapore. I know a lot of people here have read Lee Kuan Yew's autobiography. They had the looming specter of Malaysia. They had that rivalry with Malaysia. Taiwan too. Taiwan is kind of an autonomous province of China. So again, that looming specter of a big, scary neighbor. Across the board, it's like that, right? China too, and I think China is a very interesting case to look at, not necessarily as an example, but China is a 5,000-year-old civilization. Across those 5,000 years, they go through these cycles of growth and prosperity, and then they descend into internal chaos, the last one being during the era of Mao Zedong. And then you had Deng Xiaoping, who wanted to bring the country out of that chaos, right? So I think there are some lessons there for Nigeria, that there are very, very potent threats to the country's survival, and a transformation of the economy should be essential to keeping the country together, to making sure that the country survives. The second point is there's an absolute need to stabilize Nigeria's volatile balance of power. And I think this is something that I haven't gone through in a bit. In detail, I explained it more in the book. But this is the crux of the matter. The balance of power is highly unstable. So there's no, there's no room to have that orientation for long-term structural reforms. So that balance of power needs to be stabilized, I think, with some kind of systematic power sharing mechanism to reduce the volatility of political competition. And then the third point is that there needs to be a shared vision for transforming the Nigerian economy. And on this, I think I want to move beyond policymakers and leaders to focus on intellectuals and policy elites in Nigeria. The quality of the debate is really uninspiring, to say the least. There hasn't been a debate for the longest time on the balance of the role of the state and the market in the country. That happened in the 70s and in the 80s. People were publishing all of these things. You don't see that now. What should be the appropriate balance of the role of the state and the market? How do the various regions and the endowment structure complement and connect with one another, because that is how it is in almost every part of the world, whether it's France, whether it's the US, they have regional differentiations and specificities. How do you connect all of those to work together? Revenue sharing, things like that. And then I think the other ones are a bit easier, proactively tackling market failures. We know what needs to be done around infrastructure, digital connectivity, social protection, all of those, and prioritizing them, including, of course, civil service reforms. And then I think just for all of us, and this is perhaps how I started this presentation, we need to really update our mental models for how we think about the challenges that countries like Nigeria face, resource-rich countries. Next slide, please. And I'm going to conclude now. Sorry, next slide. Yep. So I decided to add 2 or 3 more slides that I call addendum. Because when I did the research for this book, and when I finished writing it, it was still kind of very internally focused, with the idea that if Nigeria is able to address this balance of power issue, is able to get on track with the difficult structural reforms, then you can start to see changes happening. But I think it's going to get even 10 times more difficult because the global economy is changing rapidly in real time as we speak. So even what was possible to do in the early 2000s will be incredibly difficult today. And I want to emphasize 2 of those shifts we're seeing in the global economy. The first is the low carbon transition. What is it? It is the fact that the entire world has to move economic systems and structures away from the carbon intensive model that we have today to one that is less carbon intensive, that generates less greenhouse gas emissions. As you know, we're all confronted with the challenge of climate change. So we need to reduce our carbon and greenhouse gas emissions. These are global discussions that are happening, and the imperative is very, very strong. A key sector that emits a lot of carbon is what? Fossil fuels, oil and gas. This is the source of Nigeria, the primary source of Nigeria's exports. The chart I have on the left-hand side of the slide is a forecast done by the International Energy Agency. And what it shows is that, as you can see, that reddish-orange area is oil, the demand for oil, which rose very, very rapidly throughout the 1990s. But it reached, they're arguing that it has already reached a peak. I don't think we're quite at the peak yet. We'll be there in a few years. But the point is, very soon that demand is going to start tapering, and then it's going to decline suddenly. I think some people exaggerated a bit by saying, oh, you know, the demand is going to collapse in like 5 years. No, it's not 5 years. It's probably going to be like 2 or 3 decades. But guess what? Most countries are preparing today for that collapse in demand. And in fact, Nigeria has already started to experience certain kinds of changes in demand for its oil resources. Let me give you an example that I'm sure a lot of you know. In 2011 or 2012, the demand for Nigeria's oil from its major importer, the United States, collapsed completely when the US became sufficient with its own domestic oil production. Today, Nigeria's major market for its oil is India. But what is happening with India? India is now getting discounted Russian crude. It's very possible that the demand from India will start to shift, even before what we see there starts to happen, right? So this should be a new imperative for Nigeria to do things differently, meaning that you have to think of new ways. We have to think about export competitiveness of all of the dynamic things happening in the economy. How do you translate those into exports? What are the new markets? And the other chart there is that, you know, while we're going to see a demand, collapsing demand of fossil fuels, particularly oil, less so gas, minerals called transition minerals, which are input to renewable energy hardware, such as solar panels, wind turbines, electric vehicle batteries, the demand is going to rise exponentially. For lithium, actually, according to the forecast, it's going to rise by more than 40-fold, over the next 2 decades or so. Graphite, cobalt, nickel, etc. Right? So these are the changes that are happening in real time today that will make things even more complicated. Next slide, please. I think the second one is, and this is why I said I was going to come back to trade. The trade environment, again, in real time, is becoming very turbulent, less open, because the major powers don't get along anymore. There are trade wars happening between the US, China, EU, also middle powers. And in fact, this graph on the left-hand side of the slide is an analysis done by Credit Suisse that shows that global trade as a share of global GDP has stagnated and is starting to decline, right? So even the idea of diversifying exports is going to be very difficult because you have to think of your export market. Countries are putting up tariffs, so it's just going to get really, really tricky. Investments too, FDI that people love to talk about. Everybody wants to attract FDI to their states, etc. It's going to get really difficult. This is an analysis done by the IMF on the right-hand side of the slide. FDI is increasingly now being informed by political considerations, not economic considerations. Governments in wealthy countries are putting in place a lot of restrictions and a lot of criteria for capital to flow to other parts of the world. So things are going to get even more difficult than they were 2 decades. Next slide. And this is the final one. And I thought to conclude here because, given where I am based in the US, the work that we're doing on US-Africa relations, I think for me, this chart is a huge tragedy, and I'll explain to you why. For the past 20 years, there has been this instrument called the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act. It provides duty-free access to the US market for exports from African countries, including Nigeria. During that time, Nigeria maximized its oil exports to the US until around, as you can see, the brown line representing exports to the US until around between 2010 and 2014 when the exports collapsed because the US had become self-sufficient in oil production. And it hasn't recovered. I just didn't want to, flood the place with too many charts because there are countries in Africa that have used Agora. And of course, there are problems. They would tell you, talk to the Kenyans, they would tell you, oh, we should have done more, we need to do more. But Kenya, Ethiopia, Lesotho, South Africa, Madagascar, they have all been able to attract some FDI in special economic zones to focus on cotton textiles and garments that, have become moribund in Kano, which is why the globalization argument to me is just not good enough, because we've seen other countries do it. Nigeria did not make use of Agora, despite Nigeria's vibrant private sector, large entrepreneurial base. Why is that? I think this is a huge tragedy. And it's going to get even more difficult because Agora is expiring in 2025. We've started discussions in DC on reauthorizing it, but we don't know if it's going to be reauthorized. So there might be another chance for Nigeria. But you had duty-free access to the world's wealthiest economy, and we didn't use it. So I'm gonna stop here. Sorry on this kind of depressing note, but I think these are the things that should be wake-up calls to all of us. Thank you.
Please, can it be louder than this for Dr. Zainab Usman? You all will agree with me that this presentation have been, it was so succinct, but yet very incisive, giving us a whole lot to meditate upon and a very good background for the next item on the agenda, which will be the panel session. And I'm really looking forward to that. But please let me also crave your indulgence to tell you that Dr. Zainab Usman's book is being sold at the lobby. So there is a book stand there, so you can kindly purchase copies for yourself and others. She would also be available after the event for autographs. But just before we go over to the next item, let me just quickly do some recognitions. Dr. Samsudeen Usman, CON, CFR, is here in our midst, the former Minister of Finance, Budget and National Planning. Please, a round of applause. Dr. Aliyu Modibo, former FCT Minister, is also here with us. Professor Ode Ojogu, former Chief Economic Advisor to the President, here with us. This room is just filled with eminent personalities, and just like Dr. Usman said in her presentation, for those of us here, we've been involved one way or the other in terms of policy formulation, policy reforms in the country. So it will really be an interesting one to hear from all of you during the Q&A session. Mr. Laole Edu is also here with us. Please, a round of applause. Mrs. Miriam Owe, Special Advisor to the President on Social Investments, is also here. Tolu Ogunlese, he is an advisor to the President on Digital Communications. Please, can we give him a round of applause too? Honorable Justice Ishaq Bello, former CJ of the FCT High Court, is here also. All right, without wasting much time, coming up next is our esteemed panel session that will diagnose, discuss, as well as recommend solutions against the backdrop of what we heard from Dr. Zainab Usman's presentation. This panel session will deliberate on the theme, just as you can see there, how Nigeria can build a post-oil economic future. So without much ado, allow me to respectfully introduce our esteemed panelists. As I introduce our panelists, we'll expect them here at the podium. Let me start by introducing His Excellency Professor Chukwuma Charles Soludo, CFR. We haven't forgotten, he's still with us online. Prof, good to see you. We can see you now. Professor Chukwuma Charles Soludo, CFR, is an economics professor and former Chief Economic Advisor to the President, Deputy Chairman, Chief Executive Officer of National Planning Commission, former Governor of the Central Bank of Nigeria, and founding Chairman of the Africa Finance Corporation. Currently, Governor of Anambra State. He joins us virtually, as you can see. Okay, fine. Prof, they can see a big round of applause for Professor Chukwuma Charles Soludo. Our next panelist is His Excellency Malam Nasir El-Rufai, former Minister of the Federal Capital Territory, Abuja, former Director General of the Bureau of Public Enterprises, BPE, author of the book, The Accidental Public Servant. If you haven't read it, please go and read it too. Governor of Kaduna State, he joins us here on the podium. Please, let's welcome Governor El-Rufai to the stage. Governor El-Rufai, you will be seated at the center. Mr. Aigboje Ike Mokwede is an investor, a banker, finance expert, former group managing director and chief executive officer of Access Bank PLC. Former chair of the Presidential Committee on the Verification of Fuel Subsidies. How can I forget that period? I won't. Author of the book titled, Leaving the Tarmac. Have we left already? Chairman and founder of Coronation Capital and co-founder and chairman of Ike Mokwede Foundation. Please, a round of applause. Our next panelist is Dr. Shubham Shaduri, former World Bank lead economist for Indonesia and a longtime staff member of the World Bank. Dr. Shaduri holds a bachelor's degree from Harvard University and a PhD from Princeton University, both in economics. Proud to join in the World Bank, he was a tenured economics professor and director of the program in economic and political development at Columbia University in New York. Dr. Shubham Shaduri is currently serving as the World Bank Country Director for Nigeria, where he develops and implements the country's partnership framework, provide customized solutions and policy advice. Please, a round of applause for him. Finally, the last but not the least, Dr. Zainab Usman. I still need to talk about her again. But we've heard from her, so she'll join us on stage as we'll take this panel session. This panel session we'll try as much as possible to do it less than 45 minutes if we can. After which we'll have 25 minutes of special interventions for many of us here in the room. We would also like to get your perspectives about what you think about Nigeria's growth and development. So we'll also be having 40 minutes of the Q&A session. So it's really going to be interesting. I'm looking forward to getting to hear from Khalifa Muhammad Sanusi II during the special interventions, Governor Fayemi, Special Advisor Miriam Owais, and a whole lot of you in the room. So I guess we will begin now. All right, I guess we'll start with Professor Chukwuma Soludo. Prof, good, yes.
Are you hearing me?
Prof, please, multimedia, can we make him a bit more audible? Prof, we can hear you, but...
It needs to be louder.
Prof, can you... Fantastic, yes.
Are you hearing me?
Yes, we can hear you now.
You can hear me now. Okay.
Okay. Prof,
thank you very much.
Prof, following the book presentation, I hope you watched Dr. Usman's presentation. Following the presentation, I would want us to examine Nigeria's current economic status. You've served in prominent roles, in Nigeria policymaking over the last 30 years or more than that. First as a professor of economics, then as a president chief economic advisor, then as governor of the central bank, and now as governor of one of Nigeria's most important regional anchor states, Anambra State. My question is, what has Nigeria struggled with in attaining fundamental economic transformation? How have these structural transformation challenges evolved over time? And how have your perspectives on these challenges changed as you have held different positions? Now you're a politician. Before, you were in the central bank. You were a professor of economics. So have your perspectives also changed? Are you going to be talking to us as a politician now? So very quickly, Prof, and perhaps 2.5 minutes if you can, answer those questions.
Well, thank you very much. I deeply appreciate it. Let me, first of all, apologize for my inability to join you all physically. I had some other engagements prior to this. And second, to come Zainab for this excellent book. I tried early hours of this morning to peruse through chapter 1, and I have listened to the presentation. And as I read it, I just keep saying to myself, this lady Sabi book, very exciting, quite frankly. And I recommend it to everyone. I'm looking forward to reading it, the entire thing. Quite frankly, as I peruse through that and listen to the presentation now, and myself, as this was going on, I just pulled from my shelf 3 or 4 of my previous books. I mean, about 15 books I have. One of them is actually The Political Economy of Economic Growth in Africa. It's about 2 volumes. I did it with, it was a global project that we did. The other is Economic Policy Choices for a Prosperous Nigeria. Of course, the first was published by Cambridge, Mass. It's 2 volumes, fat like that. This is for Nigeria, particularly published, almost addressing the kind of similar issues as here. And the third, because several of these have authors, I saw my co-authors referenced in the book by Zainab. One, the other is the politics of trade and industrial policy in Africa. And of course, our continent, our future, and so on and so forth. Going through this, writing about this, reflecting on this, not only in Nigeria, but around Africa and around the world, and coming also from Washington there, from even the sister institution, the Brookings, where Zainab is the next door neighbor. I couldn't, quite frankly, agree more with Zainab, with the fundamental thesis about the challenge of economic diversification rooted in policy choices made within a country's political and institutional configurations. And I think that's quite spot on. And for me, as you said, going through these 30-something years of being active participant in both the intellectual and policy-making arena, and now myself to continue to be part of the solution. And listening to this as well, each time I attend this kind of conference, I must tell you, on the one hand, I am participating in this one. I'm very happy that the conversation goes on. But also very sad that the diagnosis, in my own experience over these years, remain the same. In terms of the conclusions, that the challenge of rapid and sustainable prosperity. How do the challenge of rapid and sustainable prosperity, whether it's diversification, security, environment, human capital, political economy, and so on and so forth. And one message comes is that, for me, there is no single story. Across the states, within the country, episodes of triumph and decline, episodic surge and decline. Depending, and my thesis is that these episodes of surge and decline depends on the leadership at any point in time, the stock and content of human capital in the government, and then where the government gravitates in a spectrum of between what I call the two T's, transactional leadership, transformational leadership. Over the decades, you will find our leadership and performance and reforms gravitating between these two spectrums, one extremes of the extremes. Depending on where we are, we have either up or we go down, so to speak. But at the fundamental level, therefore, my point is that, first point I leave with you is that I think we should begin to mainstream case studies. Let's study those periods when we did it well. And I saw copious references to a time I can recognize, and my brother Malam El-Rufai was also in government. Copious references to the reforms we did there, banking system, telecom, and so on and so forth. And the economy grew an average of 7% year in, year out over the entire spectrum. Why did it happen? Even that time also, we managed, despite rises in oil prices, to break what can be considered a world record of maintaining an undervalued, really effective exchange rate. That is the opposite of what you find the Dutch disease syndrome would predict to happen. And we grew reserves and so on and so forth. So we need case studies of when it worked to understand why and how it worked, the kind of leadership, the kind of team, and the kind of orientation that made it work in spite of all the Nigerian and all the other things that we say. Let us celebrate more of what works, and then be able to, call out the ones that don't work and when and how they don't work. So that's my first point. And the second and the last, since we don't have time. To make the point that if we must, as I identify the challenge over time, sadly remain the same, of what I call rapid and sustainable prosperity, which economic diversification, in my view, is one of the ways to it. For us to do that, in my view, the speed and sustainability, then institutional reforms, institutional change is key. Yes, politics dominates economics. We know that. If we don't tame the politics, if we don't produce what I call productive politics, rather than the consumption-oriented, almost rent-seeking kind of distributional politics that has dominated over time, we're not going to be able to achieve both speed and sustainability. For example, I believe that institutions, and that's part of one of the many lessons from these books that I reference in terms of my previous works and the involvement in government. is that institutions can define and circumscribe politics and hence policy choices. Problem is our oil rent. It's about the institutions we've designed around it, and I will share one with you. For example, we have diagnosed and diagnosed and diagnosed. The problem now is to change it. And let's start from somewhere. And Zainab, I'm sure, as your intellectual level in terms of how, it's not our major problem, is not much about what is the problem. It's what to do, but how now to do it, dealing with the politics of it. How do we tell politics? And I give you a quote. I love this quote from the APC Manifesto 2015. And it says, and I quote, "A change agent, APC intend to cleanse our closet to halt the dangerous drift of Nigeria to a failed state with a conscious plan for post-oil economy in Nigeria. To achieve this laudable program, APC government shall restructure the country, devolve power to the units with the practices of federalism, and eliminate unintended paralysis of the center." I thought they were talking about moving towards competitive and compassionate federalism. The question, therefore, for me, let's start here. From 2015 to now, it hasn't happened. It's not, so we can't get onto this. I mean, every day again, we get onto what is. They put their finger on what the problem is. There is an obtuse, largely inefficient concentration of everything at the center.
Okay.
If you don't have the units, competitive federalism, many of these things about diversification, and we don't have time, I can write you a book about how the incentive structure today, the alignment of solid minerals owned by the center and the state owning the land on which, beneath which you have the solid minerals, the incentives around industrialization are completely whacked, that you're not going to have anything. But let me leave you with this question.
Okay.
This question.
Prof, can you hear me?
And I think it might help us. Let me just put this question as a question.
Okay.
When we compare countries and talk about how they should do, I'm sure Zainab and others and your research might help us more on answering about how many multi-ethnic, multi-religious, large developing countries with multi-party democracies and electoral cycles every 4 years, do you really have a political elite that focusing predominantly on long-term sustainable transformation?
Okay.
Without focusing on the short term and so on survival politically. I have quite a couple of other things, but let me leave it here.
Prof.
The question is the how.
Okay.
And this is where
Prof.
and I want to believe that as we transit now, we might begin seriously to focus on this. How do we get it done? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof. Thank you very much. Prof, but I expected you to give us solutions. I didn't expect you to end with asking questions. The last time I checked, I'm the one asking the questions. So you should give me the solutions. So, Governor El-Rufai, Professor Soludo acknowledged the work you did during, of course, as FCT Minister and as the DG of BP at that time. But what all of us in this room can acknowledge is that politics influences economic decision. I would like you to speak about, based on your experience, what the difficulties are in executing difficult reforms. How can a consensus be achieved and sustained on the critical agenda of economic transformation? If we take a look at, for example, the issue of fuel subsidy has been on for many years. I remember Khalifa is seated here. I remember those days, Khalifa and the former Minister of Finance, Okonjo-Iweala. I interviewed them then. It was removal of subsidy. We're still talking about it now. How many years? 11 years again. So how can a consensus be achieved? And please, can we also make it short? Answers. Thank you.
You are asking a politician to make it short? When I looked at this panel, I wondered why I was invited, and then I explained it away by saying, well, Soludo was former central bank governor, economist, and so on. World Bank, businessman. I realized that I was chosen because I'm the only politician here. Soludo just joined us. Let me first answer his question that he posed, the last question he posed. Yes, there are examples of countries with 4-year election cycles that have natural resources whose path has deviated from that of Nigeria. Indonesia is one, Malaysia is another that come to my mind immediately. So I have answered this question on your behalf. But coming back to what you said, you know, Zainab's book is perhaps, in my view, the most important book about the Nigerian economy in the last 1 or 2 decades. It truly looks at the problems, and as Professor Soludo said, you know, she's right on the money. She got it. It's all politics. Politics trumps everything. And if you don't have the proper political settlement, it becomes extremely difficult to have elite consensus, to have long-term plans that everyone will buy into across party lines and so on. And it just becomes, you know, based on accidents and luck. I was part of that one accident that everyone is talking about, the second term of Obasanjo and the aftermath, when we exited London and Paris clubs, we averaged 7% annual GDP growth for a long period. And Professor Soludo's suggestion that perhaps we should not despair, but look at that period and see what did we do right. Because it means Nigeria can do it. We can replicate this. It was all Nigerians, and it was a Nigerian president. It was a 4-year election cycle. But we're able to do so much in that period and laid a solid foundation for our successors. But something went wrong somewhere. I think there is a need to study that and then understand it. We can talk about it. Some of us that were part of it. We can talk about it in a few words. I think political leadership matters. If you don't have political will to take very difficult decisions that may be unpopular in the short term, but solves long-term problems that the rest of the people may not see, but you know it has to be done, then you are in good shape. Secondly, if you have political leadership that is legitimate and strong will to pursue difficult decisions, you need a competent team. You need a solid team. The Nigerian cabinet consists of something like 40 ministers. You don't need more than 10 solid ministers to move the entire cabinet along. And what Obasanjo did in his second term was to pick a few of us that had no political ties, but had a track record either in the private sector or development community and so on, and put us together and said, I want to get debt relief. Okay? Do whatever you can to make sure we get debt relief. This was the crisis that compelled Obasanjo in his second term to focus. And this was what gave us, as the economic team, the leeway to do anything we wanted. There was nothing we take to Obasanjo that he would not approve, because he wanted to go down as the president that eliminated Nigeria's foreign debt, which has been an albatross for 2 decades. And Ngozi gave us the leadership. She assembled the team. We were all technocrats. We were not political. Obasanjo handled the politics. He backed us up. And that's why we were able to do what we did. Okay? We were lucky oil prices started rising, but we saved the excess revenues. We ensured the exchange rate was actually undervalued. You know, the team was very disciplined. So you need leadership. You need a competent team. and you need to communicate and explain to people what you're doing, because often people are willing to support the government. Nigerians are very supportive of their government if they understand what you're doing and they can see light at the end of the tunnel. So to me, this is an outline of what we should be looking at. But this issue of political settlement is a very important issue, and we must come back to it. And in very practical terms, okay, we have to, as politicians, as political leaders, face our problems and be realistic about our problems, have realism about our situation, and be pragmatic about our solutions. And then we should agree across political divides, focus on those solutions, and just get on with them while explaining to the people what we're doing, why we're doing what we're doing. In my view, and Soludo mentioned, read excerpts from the APC manifesto of 2015, which we wrote, and we are committed to it. Why were you not able to do it? I chaired the APC committee on restructuring, for instance, and we gave very wide-ranging recommendations to try to move Nigeria back to the original political settlement of 1954. People forget that in 1954, our leaders, our political leaders from Nigeria went to London and agreed on what Nigeria's federal structure should be. And when we got independence, that structure worked. The regions were competing. The center was focused on a few things that it was doing well. The regions carried most of the responsibilities, and the revenues were distributed in favor of the regions so that they would handle the bulk of that. That was the political settlement that our founding fathers agreed. This political settlement was destroyed in 1966 when the military took over, and because of the civil war, everything was reversed. Nigeria operated more or less like a unitary state, both in political and fiscal terms, because of the civil war. After the civil war, that unitary status was never reversed because the military kept ruling and kept preserving that status. If Nigeria wants to have a political, the kind of political settlement Zainab is referring to, that will enable us agree on certain things and work on them no matter what, we have to go back to that political settlement of 1954-55 and devolve more power, responsibility, and revenues to the states, and narrow the size and scope of the federal government to things that it can do very well on behalf of the federation, and leave most of the responsibilities to the states. Okay? And we made recommendations that will move in that direction in 2018, but somehow, again, because of political will, it was never implemented. In my experience in public service in the last 20 years, the biggest impediment to implementing policies or even formulating sound policies and so on is the nature of our politics. Okay? We have a political culture that has no regard for public service, that's driven by pursuit of personal interest, and most of the time, okay, self-enrichment or enrichment of my state or my ethnic group is a toxic political culture that has developed. And until we find a way to address it as politicians, some code of ethics that should at least say, let's agree that education is important, health is important, infrastructure is important, and we should not be spending 10 times the amount of money on subsidy, for instance, than we are spending on health, education, and infrastructure combined. Okay, so it has to start from politics, it has to start from politicians, and I am happy that we're at a point now with a new government coming in, that there is an opportunity for the President-elect Asiwaju Bola Ahmed Tinubu to open the space for this kind of conversation And that conversation should cut across party lines. Let us agree as Nigerians what are our most serious problems and what we need to do to address them, no matter how painful, and agree.
Okay.
And then we can move forward.
Okay. Thank you very much, Governor El-Rufai. You also give us some things to think about. And I would really like us to even leave this room with a sense of the how, from the book presentation of Dr. Usman. And let's get a sense of the how, because you just mentioned the work you did, restructuring and all of that. It seems that we all know the problems, but the question is, how do we solve them? So that we don't start rehashing questions or questions. No, Governor, I'll come back to you later.
Yeah.
No, I want to come to...
I just want to respond to that quickly.
Okay.
In my view, I've told you the how. Okay, the how is, let's look at what happened in 2003 to 2010.
So what's distorting the how? Because you mentioned we have a transactional politics. How do we clean up the political class? How do we clean up that system? But that would be another question. Just ruminate on it, because since you are the only politician here physically present on this panel. Now, Mr. Imakode, let me come to you. It seems the private sector background, so perhaps we'll dilute this a bit. With your experience, based on your vast private sector experience as Chief Executive Officer of one of the top financial institutions in the country, and now as the head of one of the top foundations focused on public sector, what is this about public, private, state business relationship that needs to improve? In what areas should Nigeria's public sector really step up its provision of public goods and better facilitate private sector in achieving economic transformation? What we've also seen over the past few decades is that there seems to be a dearth of trust between private sector and public sector.
Thank you. And I think it's necessary to kind of understand what Zainab has said, what Prof is saying, and what Malam El-Rufai is saying. Your history, in many ways, defines your future. In many ways. Okay? And if you think about economics, some of the most important economists have been what they call economic historians.
Yeah.
Okay? And there's a reason for that. Now, there are 3 periods where our nation has performed. Just before independence, 58, 66. Slightly after the Civil War, 72 to 79, 78. Okay? And basically 2000, 2007, 2008. Okay? I have studied those periods. But let me tell you why, as a private sector person, I have studied those periods. If you put private sector players in Nigeria in a room, they will tell you, we are the engine. We are the engine of the Nigerian, let's say, not even the economy, the Nigerian competitive context, okay? And if you want to take vehicles as that analogy, okay, Nigeria is a vehicle competing with other vehicles, Malaysia, Indonesia, and so on. And I believe that certainly the private sector is the engine of that vehicle. But then the vehicle also has other parts. Wheels, a frame, it has passengers also, which are the citizens. But most importantly, all right, a vehicle doesn't move unless it's started. A vehicle goes in the direction that the driver takes it. And when you think about a driver, you also think about a driver and the driving team. All vehicles are driven by government. So however powerful that engine is, 1 billion horsepower, okay? If your driver doesn't have the capacity to handle the car, right? That's what's going to dictate how far you move and how fast you move. Now, let me also tell you something. It's not one person, it's not a president, it's a government, okay? So if you think again about the analogy of the vehicle, think about all those civil servants you take for granted, those public servants, and imagine that they all have the power to pour fuel into that vehicle. It could be a diesel engine. They pour petrol inside. You see it now? Aha. Okay? All right? They don't know that there's a cliff in front. Okay? However powerful the engine is, going to drive over. And the problem is this. If we go back in history, there was a consensus that came out of an enlightened understanding that for Nigeria to work and perform, that every other nation that has performed has, is that you must have equal capacity in the public sector and the private sector. And when I left Access Bank, having seen this reality, even in the banking sector, you refer to my book. In my book, I said, see, the success of banking in Nigeria is as much, yes, the success of us as CEOs, but really the success of that team, that government at that time. And in my book, I said the reason why I did everything to buy a bank when I did was that spending time with that team, with Ngozi, with Professor Soludo, with Malam El Rufai and co, I knew that if I missed this moment, to be hard, however skilled I was as a private sector person. So we did everything to get into banking at that time. Okay? So if you think about the how, we have to go back to the type of understanding between the private sector and public sector, which, back again, I will go back to in 1960. We said this nation will be run through 3 regions largely, one small one where I come from, Midwest, appeared, okay? And we would focus on making the Nigerian dream come true. There was only one thing that these people realized, that you are competing. And to compete, therefore, you had to have your best. Now, let me describe the 3 or 4 heads of civil service in the regions. Ali Akilu, Udoji, Simeon Adebo, and another man called Joseph Imokwede, who just happened to be my uncle. That's not why I've started supporting the public sector. Now, common to all of them is incredible capacity. Some of them were given awards by other countries. Some of them, when they died, their obituary notices were in the New York Times. That is the type of capacity for the work they did in Nigeria. Now, when you think about the Western region and how it developed, if you see the numbers of outstanding men and women developed by Simeon Adebo, come to the north. Have you heard of the name Ali Akilu? Okay. London School of Economics. I mean, this is a wonderful, talented man by any global standard. How will Nigeria fly? Okay. Sorry, you have to give me small time.
Just a minute more.
Today, Zainab spoke about Kano. The story of Kano is as much a story of a nation distracted by oil wealth, development in Abuja, and this belief after a while that let's focus on 1,000 people dividing either $30 billion to $50 billion every year amongst 100,000 people. And people in Kano saw it. The power to be was a Kano man. Everybody in Kano came here. That's what happened. When we made the rentier economy more important than the real economy. When our priorities were no longer who is building textiles, who has the cotton mills, who has the tanneries in Kano, and more about who is going to get the next contract. Okay? And that's what we celebrated. That's our nation today. Now, can we fix it? Of course we can. Do you know why I think we can fix it? Okay? Nigeria is the most blessed country in Africa, given our people. Okay? There's a reason why Ghana has gone to the IMF 16 times since independence. And anytime it comes to Nigeria going to the IMF, we're ready to almost die before we go. Because we believe in ourselves. We're dynamic. We're very entrepreneurial. Most importantly, we're very patriotic. So what you are hearing from these speakers before me is that we have a new government come May 29th. The only way that government will perform is if we go back to those roots in 1954 that he spoke about, where merit, okay, in the interest of this nation flying or that vehicle competing better than all the other vehicles is what determines how this government that comes in will be run.
I thought I would get a round of applause for Mr. Etimokede. Thank you very much. Now let's come over to Dr. Shaduri. The World Bank is one of Nigeria's important development partners. In fact, your motto is fighting poverty. Over there in Washington, you see it on the floor. And sometimes when I pass, I'll be like, how long have the World Bank been fighting poverty? Over 70 years. I hope you're so successful. But you assist Nigeria in, in many analytic outputs like the Nigeria Development Update, the country memorandum, and all of that. My question to you is, what type of policy reforms have proven the most difficult for Nigeria to implement? I see Shubham is winking at me. Nancy, you want to ask me that question? What type of policy reforms are really difficult for us to implement in order to diversify and restructure, like Governor El-Rufai mentioned earlier, based on the analytical outputs as well as the advisory work that you've done? Are there comparator countries such as Indonesia, Brazil, India, that we can learn from? What have they done that would also make us overcome some of these reform constraints?
Thank you. Thank you, Nancy. And thank you, Zainab and Waziri, for including me on this. I mean, I'm actually wondering, Governor El-Rufai said he's wondering why he is. He's just being modest. I truly am wondering why I'm here. I mean, in part, look, usually the World Bank is brought in to provide this international experience, but I want to note that you've done that in the book and in the presentation, and you were at the World Bank at one point. So, but let me turn to the question that Nancy asked. Look, I can answer that question in technical economic terms, or I can answer that in more political terms. So
okay.
Let me take the first, technical economic terms, and let me just take two countries as points of reference. They happen to be two countries that I know the best. I'm from India, so I know India, and I spent 5 years in Indonesia. But I also think that those two countries, India and Indonesia, are in some ways the best kind of comparator or peer countries for Nigeria in terms of being large, ethnically, religiously diverse, noisy, multi-party democracies. Indonesia and Nigeria are even closer. They have a similar history of 30 years of military rule, a transition to this noisy democracy in the late 90s, etc. So those two countries. In economic terms, at some point in both Indonesia and India, two basic facts or kind of realities of policymaking and development, I think, were agreed on by the elites. One is macrofiscal, kind of core macrofiscal management. In Indonesia, this was triggered. There was a period of that in the military rule during the Suharto era, but more than anything else, it was triggered by the 1998 Asian financial crisis, where Indonesia had to go to the IMF. And that was at the national level, whether or not people supported Suharto or sympathized with him, this was a thing as a national trauma. And since then, if there's one thing that the political elites agree on, it's the need for proper macrofiscal management. Does not mean, everything's solved, but that one thing that we are not going to get into that kind of macrofiscal crisis again is something that's shared by all the elites. Second thing I would say, and then here let me refer to the example of India, is a basic understanding or commitment or recognition, I would say, of the role of private investment in a nation's development. No country has eliminated poverty without private firms growing and creating the jobs that pull people out of subsistence agriculture, pull people out of kind of hustling on this, informal sector. It is always private firms growing and investing. In India, there was the suspicion of private investment. We came with a socialist kind of mentality out of independence, and somewhere in the early 90s and through the 90s into the 2000s, that changed, that light bulb went off. So in technical economic terms, these are the two things that, India, Indonesia, where they, that recognition amongst the elites happened, which has, in some senses, yet to happen in. Second, let me answer from a political perspective, and now I'm really out of my depth here. But look, Zainab's absolutely right, and you've heard all the other eminent speakers here confirm that. Politics is ultimately at the root. Development is political. And as Zainab points out, economic policy outcomes, and hence development outcomes, are rooted in political reality. Of course, there's a back and forth. Economic policy outcomes resulting in good development can be a virtuous cycle which enables and facilitates politics, right? You can be re-elected based on transactional politics, or you can be re-elected based on delivering development. So I'm not saying it's completely one way, but at a root, there has to be a political consensus or a political settlement or elite consensus that everyone, including the elites, will be better off, will have a bigger piece of the pie if the national pie grows. So I've said this before, I've worked in every country in Asia. What separates out the countries that have actually embarked on this dynamic upward trajectory of inclusive growth and prosperity are the ones where the elites, it's not that they're any more or any less self-interested, they're just a bit more longer-term oriented, recognizing that by growing the national pie, that's the way to have a bigger piece of the pie. Okay? And that requires trust amongst them. So let me end with this. It's ultimately a political statement. People talk in Nigeria about the trust deficit between the state and the citizens, or between private firms and the government. I think the most fundamental trust deficit is within the elites. Okay? All right? Because we are in a situation where, in economics, we call it tragedy of the commons, which is a situation where within a community, everyone recognizes what's the right thing to do, what will benefit everyone. But if any one person tries to do the right thing and the others don't follow, then they're going to be worse off. Okay? Fishing communities that overfish, as a result of which the fishing grounds are laid barren. That's a classic tragedy of the commons, right? In a sense, that's the kind of problem that Nigeria is wrestling with. You can call it a political settlement, lack of an elite consensus, but until there is that collective trust amongst the elites that it is in everyone's collective interest to do the right things, to do transformational politics as opposed to transactional politics, the pie will not grow bigger. In fact, there's a risk that the pie will continue to shrink. Okay? Now, how do you change that? I think that's where the other speakers here will be much better. But it's a how which is ultimately political.
Okay, Dr. Usman, you want to come in here?
Is it on? Okay. I just want to respond quickly, and by way of thinking about solutions, I think I want to reflect on just my experience doing this research and what I found. Going through, I did archival research. I read a lot of the pre-independence and post-independence policy documents, speeches. There are people I spoke to, people who have played roles in the 60s, maybe not 60s, it was 70s, 80s, etc. And what stood out to me is this idea of, whether it's a consensus or the political settlement. It's not that it has not existed, it's just that even when something is forged, it does not endure. It breaks down, it becomes fragile, and then we end up having what we have. So the key question is, and I don't know if anyone else in the audience can come in during the Q&A session, to talk about why is it that there tends to be these frequent breakdowns. Governor El-Rufai mentioned the pre-independence political settlement with the regional arrangement, which actually drove a lot of growth. And that collapsed into a civil war. Then after that, there was a military consensus, and I talk about it in, I think, chapter 4 of the book. And I know a lot of the military rulers get a lot of flack, and I started off that way, but then down the line, I started to have some sympathy for some people, the challenges they face. You had a country collapsing, what were you gonna do, right? You could also argue that some of them played specific roles, but you just had to and this is the thinking of the military, kind of bring everything together under a central command, and that held for a certain period, and then it collapsed, right? And then the early 2000s that I spoke about, there was, all of us were alive at the time, we remember that there was a certain kind of consensus and cohesion that is hard to find now. So what happened? Why do we have these frequent breakdowns, and how do you prevent that from happening? Then when you are able to secure that consensus, how do you identify the crucial policy reforms that have to be elevated above politics? I think this is what you find in some other countries, and I want to talk about Botswana, for example, that you have one political party, people change, but there are certain things that they will not touch in that country around the way they do their mining development agreements. And again, you can quibble about Botswana being still dependent on diamonds, but they don't have the kind of poverty or the certain kinds of instabilities you find in Nigeria. So how do you forge that consensus, prevent it from collapsing in like a 5 or 7 year period as we've seen historically, and then identify the crucial policy reforms that have to be elevated above politics, so that if, whether it's any senator or anyone who comes and decides to meddle with that, everybody's going to attack them, because people are like, no, that is a no-go area for us in this country.
Okay. Thank you very much. Fantastic point there, and it's interesting that you brought in the Botswana example. I would go another round of questions, but I want to crave your indulgence because we don't have time anymore. A minute for the response, please, so that we can take the Q&A. Professor Soludo, I will come back to you, and I'm appealing to you specifically for time. Now that you're a politician, I have 2 politicians here on the panel. God save me. Now, you are Anambra State Governor, and one of the economic hubs in the country is in Nnewi. I heard someone say, over here. Over in Abia State, we have Aba and all of that. So you have economic hubs around the country. What is required, really, to rapidly enhance sub-national productivity in order to build these businesses, these clusters, make them internationally competitive, and provide good paying jobs for millions of young Nigerians? You see that even some of the products that are made in perhaps Aba, Nnewi, fantastic products, but they will put it made in China there. They can't even put made in Aba or made in Nnewi. So very quickly, Professor Soludo. Prof, can you unmute yourself, please?
Oh.
Yes, we can hear you now.
No, I'm muted. I don't know.
Yes, we can hear you now.
Are you hearing me now?
Yes, we can, Prof.
You can hear me. Oh, thank you very much. I said it's a very long question with you want 1 second answer. I want to say Nnewi, for example. Nnewi is one of those paradoxes and tragedies of the country. And it's an illustration of, and a case study of where firms, private sector, have tried to industrialize in spite of government. Then wait, the octopus weight of government, try to constrain them to what I call a low-speed trap equilibrium, as it were. That's national tragedy. What has been missing, and why Nnewi is where it is that there has been a lack of a national strategy for export-led industrialization. We don't have this strategy, and there is no focus on that. The infrastructure that you need to do that, access to long-term the macroeconomic environment, transport and power sector, and everything else. We need deliberate strategy for export-led industrialization. And that's kind of, if you begin to have an institutional framework, let's the El-Rufai's committee, the APC. That is what I call the minimalist, the recommendations of that committee. Is minimal that will require to begin to unbundle and make transactional politics less attractive and concentrated at the center. And then you can unleash the potentials at the base. Even from Anambra, we're doing everything. There is the federal government has signed up with us on automotive in the government for over 6-7 years now. It's still in the books. It's still yet to come. And the state is constrained because the federal government is overlooking over there. The macro framework make it difficult for people to have access to long-term financing, as it were, even globally, and so on and so forth. So I think part of this quest for transformational leadership, transformational agenda, which I'm very happy to know that with the new government now coming into place, it has a chance for a fresh start. And it has to start with assembling the team and getting to work on this institutional line that unbundles and tries to, if you like, devolve several of these powers and concentrations at the center. You can't run Nigeria, everything from Abuja. It's impossible. And we need to now unleash the competitive force at the lower levels to also work. And enable those institutions to also experiment and grow. We are afraid that, the states or the local governments can have this and so on. You can't grow letting it. The only way we have a country is to let us experiment, fail, experiment. And that's how other countries have developed. You must unleash the base for you to have competitive systems. You cannot have a competitive economy without having a competitive system. And for me, that will be the beginning point to getting NEWI and getting all the other such clusters and so on and so forth to get on a path to sustainable development, sustainable transformation, long term.
Thank you very much, Professor Soludo. All right, Governor El-Rufai, it's no longer news. We talk about it every day. Rising public debt. With the securitization of CBN's ways and means, our public debt has ballooned now to over about 70 trillion. Naira declining all revenues. Dr. Usman, during her presentation, it really baffles me that in the last 2 years, really, oil price has been at close to $100 US. And Nigeria is not smiling to the bank at all for that. We have a lot of things that we cannot afford to pay for right now. How can Nigeria now proceed with these difficult but necessary reforms and retaining the support of the vast majority of Nigerians? Because we did mention earlier that there needs to be communication, there needs also to be trust between the government and the citizens. You also talked about the political class. What will really be the incentive, for heaven's sake, for the political class to lead us right? Like Mr. Igboje said earlier, if you don't have a good driver, the car will not go anywhere. So what will be the incentive for us to have a good driver or a good team?
Well, I gave you the example of 2003 when President Obasanjo said, I want debt relief, do whatever it takes. Often it helps when you have a crisis, okay? When your back is against the wall, when you have no choice but to take hard, difficult decisions. No country wants to go to the IMF, as Indonesia did, and they said never again. But I think that where we are now, our level of indebtedness, where our revenues are, the size of our government, the federal government, and the number of states struggling, we have backed ourselves against the wall. Okay? We don't have any choice. Nigeria must, address those subsidies, the PMS subsidy, the foreign exchange subsidy. They must be addressed tomorrow. Otherwise, we'll end up in the arms of the IMF before the end of the year. I think that that kind of understanding by the political elite will bring everyone to his senses so that we are, as I said earlier, we are realistic about facing our problems and our situation. Do not engage in blame game. We are where we are. You can blame everyone till kingdom come, but you are there to provide solutions, and we must find a solution to that problem and move on. We have to be very sensible and pragmatic about, solving our problems. And I think we are at that point. We are at that critical juncture in Nigeria's economic and political history that we don't have a choice but to sit down and agree that the only way to save the country, the only way to prevent this country going the way of Sri Lanka, for instance, is to absolutely do away with some of these distortions and then try to put all these policies in place that will unleash the competitiveness of Nigerians, that will move the political system towards the 1954 political settlement, for instance. That means, making the federal government smaller, making it less attractive, and, devolving more power, responsibilities, burdens, and revenues to the states, okay? Because in the short term, Nigeria cannot increase its revenues. We collect 6% of GDP as tax revenues. We cannot change it to 20% in 1 year, in 5 years. You need a long-term plan. And where we are now, the solution for our revenue problems is not to increase taxes or introduce more taxes. Businesses are struggling after COVID and Ukraine. And if you want businesses that are 95% of Nigeria's economy to thrive, you have to, step back from thinking that it is by imposing more taxes that you'll collect more money. You should be looking at expanding the tax base. Most Nigerians don't pay the correct taxes. Why don't you look at expanding the tax base and even reduce the rate of taxation? But that's a long-term plan. In the short term, I am of the view, and others may disagree with me, but in the short term, Nigeria has no alternative. We have to do this. And the political elite must realize the danger ahead and come together, reduce the mutual suspicions, and get the best people. We must put our first 11, okay, in government if we are going to even begin to address these problems. I made reference to the First Republic and the quality of the people in the public service then. We need to get back to that. We need to get brilliant people back in public service. Oil companies, banks, and telecoms companies should not take our brightest people. We must bring them back into government. We must bring them back into public service. But at the end of the day, we must also pray that the political leadership that we already have elected, we can't change that. We must pray that the political leadership at national and subnational levels have the political will to address these problems, do the right thing, but engage with society, engage with the public so that our circumstances are explained. We are not an oil-rich country. We are not. The amount of oil we pump out is not enough to make Nigeria rich. We should stop thinking that we are an oil-rich country. We are poor. And when oil prices rose the last time, the subsidy, the PMS subsidy, took the entire revenues. Every state government is struggling to pay salaries because of that. So we must face these realities, particularly at this point in time when there is a transition to a new government, and begin to do the right thing so that we take our country out of this quagmire and put it on a path sustainable development.
Okay, thank you, Governor El-Rufai, for that. If you want to attract people in the private sector to the public sector, I don't think you're going to do that with a 30,000 naira minimum wage. I don't think you're going to do that right now with the way the public sector is structured. We had super PAMSECs at that time because the country was working. Governor El-Rufai, I'm just saying this as a statement. I don't want to come back to you.
You have to choose. You have to choose whether you want to have a dysfunctional government that will ensure that the private sector collapses. Okay. You can go to the private sector looking for money, but as Ike pointed out, if the government does not work, the companies will die. You
What
will
will
lose
be
that.
the incentive
You will lose
to
that high
bring
paying
those
job.
people
So
in?
what I'm saying is, people must make the sacrifice. Just
Sacrifice
as some
of
of us are
what,
making.
Governor? 30,000 naira is the minimum wage. Anyway, that's like a topic for another day.
Choose what
Battle.
country you want.
Okay.
That's it.
Okay, Mr. Aigboje, do you want to comment? As well as just to also add to your question, if there are any big ticket items that you believe, even with our challenges, that we can capitalize on?
Okay, I don't want to run away from the fact that and I will talk about these opportunities, but like I've said, even if the engine of the car has a million horsepower, if the driver, the mechanics, the team that handles that car don't have the capacity, forget it. Because it's not just a car running by itself, it's a car running in competition with, others. So the one thing that we must understand is that Nigeria has 3 options in front of it, given where we find ourselves today. 3 options, in economics and finance, there are no other options. I'll tell you what the 3 are. Fiscal consolidation. Fiscal consolidation simply means that if you cannot afford certain things, don't do them. And I'm not saying that it's not good to have a subsidy on fuel if you can afford it. I'm not saying it's not good to subsidize fertilizer inputs if you can afford it. But if you cannot afford it, all you are doing, by afford means, that because subsidies are meant to stimulate productivity. The subsidies are not meant to be a hole that just keeps getting deeper and deeper. By offering the subsidy, it introduces a level of competition, that basically improves productivity and the wealth of the nation. So fiscal consolidation is remove all the leakages and tighten that budget. Think about it. Right now, revenue profile, 7 trillion naira. Debt stock, 70 trillion naira. Which interest rate do you want to use? Which one now? Which one do you want to use? Inflation, 20%. Okay, so even if we say, okay, fine, we can force people to, lend us money at half, it's 10% at least. So your current revenue profile is just barely enough to service interest. Okay? Then there's nothing left. Okay? The second option, right, if you don't do fiscal consolidation, is debt restructuring. Now,
Shubham is there, so
debt restructuring is a very painful process, extremely painful process. I don't advocate it because really, when I say debt restructuring, I'm not saying the genius in President Obasanjo is that he got debt forgiveness. He restructured his debt in the most miraculous manner. There is a cost to debt restructuring, which is that for the period of restructuring, there's a lot of trauma that the state has to take. The third option is massive private sector investment. Massive private sector investment. That's not going to come by signaling that you are going to increase taxes. No, that's not what you do. So think about this type of scenario. If every minister that is appointed into the new government, every ambassador that is appointed to a state, a nation, every permanent secretary, every parastatal and so on is given a private sector investment target year by year. Oil and gas target, education target, technology target, agriculture target, and it's simple. If you don't make your target, assuming, of course, the will is there, let the person leave the place for another person who will go and deliver the target. So those are our three options.
Okay. Dr. Shaduri, let's come to you now. How do you get, with what we've heard right here in the room, and I know your different engagements with people in government, how can various stakeholders now break out of this insular thinking and begin to think that when we come together, we have a larger pie? Unlike what we're seeing right now, the mutual suspicion which you talked about. How do we get people now to understand these profound difficulties, that even in those difficulties, there are opportunities for us? How do we now get them to begin to think with the urgency of acting now?
I think it's largely what Governor El-Rufai, Governor Saludo, they've all said, which is transformational leadership and engagement. Look, this is not something certainly that the World Bank has a technical solution for. What we can say is in what other countries, those have been the factors, ultimately a political solution, a political consensus. What we are happy to say and will keep saying over and over, actually, if that one element of consensus can be reached, even among about these basic fundamentals, I think Governor Saludo calls them the unsustainable. Nigeria's potential can be unlocked, and then it'll be, kind of self-fulfilling. That once the wider public, everyone begins to see the fruits, I think that itself will be self-sustaining, but there needs to be that initial consensus to begin that process.
Okay, thank you very much. Dr. Usman, a final response for you, very, very quickly. We've got to go to the audience, yes.
I think very quickly what I want to pick up on is what something maybe innocuous that Governor El-Rufai mentioned about, we need to stop the blame game. And I want to give you a very short story. A few months ago, actually it was late last year, I was part of a panel at the Nigeria Economic Summit Group, and I'm not going to mention names. You can go and watch the video of that panel. And someone on the panel, very prominent, actually started this blame game, talking about some conspiracy theories. There are people and groups holding back this and that. And, I tried to respond, but we were out of time. And I personally find that extremely frustrating, that you find sometimes people in prominent places talking about these conspiracy theories. No, there's nobody holding Nigeria back. It is an epic failure on the part of so many people. And the problem is this blame game, Nigerians will continue playing it until one day everybody will wake up and it's like 2070, people have flying cars, and people are still blaming one region or the other. That is going to be the reality, right? So I suppose then the big point, or the main point that I want to make here is, I think I despair at the quality of public discourse in this country right now. I mentioned something about thinking about the role of the state and the market, the role of the private sector. We don't see those kinds of meaningful debates happening even among academics in this country. It's all like at the gutter right now, and it's really a tragedy. So I think there is also an onus on the media, civil society, intellectuals to try to elevate the quality of discourse, because this affects everybody. You have a green passport. When you go to the border, customs in any country, they're not looking at your religion or region. You're going to get treated the same way.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Usman. I think, please, can you give this panel a round of applause? It's time for us now to get some special interventions, and I'll crave that the ushers are ready with the microphones. Please, let's take our first intervention from Khalifa Muhammad Sanusi II. I'm interested to hear what the Khalifa has got to say today. The Khalifa just said, Nancy, you want to put me in trouble, but let's see.
Nancy is looking for headlines, and I'm very likely to disappoint today. So let me begin by congratulating Zainab on this book. I told her I was supposed to have left the country yesterday, but when she informed me of this event, I changed my plans. Zainab is a young lady that I have been watching for a long time, since she wrote some articles about me when I was governor of Central Bank, which were not always totally complimentary, but which kept us on our toes, issues that she raised. And as she said, the first thing that struck me about her writings was that, unlike the usual Nigerian tirade against public officers, either talking about where you come from or what faith you profess, these were arguments around economics. And in economics, it's you have different views, and what's important is to be able to justify and rationalize your opinions. And I've monitored her over the years. I'm very proud of what she's done, and I think as Nigerians, we should be proud of what she has done. Now, this second, and this is a health warning, I'm not a believer in not blaming. I think if you do well, you get praised. If you do badly, you get blamed. I don't believe in covering up incompetence. I don't believe in being politically correct and not saying that something was not done properly. And if we want to really make progress in this country, we have to learn from the good and the bad. We have to see what we did right, but we also have to look at where we went wrong. And we have to do it in a very smart manner. It doesn't mean that we get mired in this constant attack on individuals, but if we do not understand where we took missteps, where we went off course, we're not likely to get back on course. So where are we today? We're going to have a government sworn in on May 29th. And I think it's time to start saying, what do we expect of that government? What do we as Nigerians believe we should be seeing as a sign that we are heading in the direction that this panel and other panels have talked about over the years? Now, I would like to basically restrict my comments to about three areas. The first has been talked about, which is competence. If there's one thing Obasanjo did right, and Yar'Adua and Jonathan, I don't want to call names, because if they would Nigerians, if you call the names of people who did right, then people will put in the names of those you did not call and say, and the next headline is, okay. So, but in general, putting in round pegs in round holes is extremely important. You can have a very, very good minister who's a very competent lawyer. He's not necessarily your best finance minister or your best planning minister. It's not an attack on the person. It's just that you put him in a place where his skills were not needed. So with this government, I hope what we will see is round pegs in round holes, square pegs in square holes. Okay, let's see people who are capable of delivering, and who a government that recognizes the depth of the crisis that we're in. I've been saying this for 2 years. I even said before elections that if anybody tells Nigerians that 2023 will be easy, they should not vote for that person. It's going to be difficult. The second thing is, we need to begin to understand at the level of public discourse the difference between economics and populism. And this is a duty for all of us. We all criticize government, but we also have a duty of conveying as much as possible the implications of the policies that we recommend. When Nancy, you remember when we tried to remove fuel subsidy in 2011, and there were huge debates. And the main issue was, you're going to impose suffering on Nigerians. You're going to increase the price of fuel. And we tried to explain that it was bad economics. For every $1 billion Nigeria spends on fuel subsidy, it is $1 billion out of education, $1 billion out of healthcare, $1 billion out of power, $1 billion out of infrastructure. So don't tell me, oh, I'm going to increase the price of fuel. Come out and say what you are saying. What you are saying is that for the poor people of this country, cheap fuel is more important than education, more important than healthcare, more important than power. And if you do that for 30, 40 years, what kind of country are you going to have? Which is what we have had. Okay, that's the first thing. The second thing is, I've always said, if you take fuel subsidy as an example, that we have never had fuel subsidy. We've had a hedge. Okay? And a naked hedge. And I will tell you, in finance, the worst hedge you take is a naked hedge. A subsidy is you say, okay, if the price is X, we'll pay 20% of it. That's a subsidy. But if I tell you, you will never pay more than X for a product whose price I do not control, it doesn't matter whether oil price is $200 or $150 a barrel or $100 a barrel, the Nigerian government has an unlimited pocket. It will fund the difference. The exchange rate can move from 150 to 500 naira. The Nigerian government has, and it will fund you. It's stupidity. You're heading to bankruptcy. It's bankruptcy. We were walking into bankruptcy with our eyes open. We can't ignore that. And therefore, if I have a new government on May 29 that tells me, oh, I'm going to continue paying this subsidy for the next 3 years, I'll freeze over 3 years, I'm going to say you're not serious. I mean, I'm going to just close my eyes and get ready for the next election in 2027 because we're going to be here in 2027 talking about the same things. People say phase it. What happens if you start phasing and a year from now, you've had a massive devaluation? Okay, so we need to prepare the minds of Nigerians. I think that there are bad decisions that have bankrupted this country and we have to close that hole. I'm not going to talk about the fact that the subsidy is all a scam and the fraud in it, which we all know, okay? I've said enough of that. But these decisions need to be taken from day one. And Nigerians need to understand that without these decisions, freeing up fiscal space, you are never going to have the investments you want in human capital to diversify the economy. You don't have the fiscal space. So the conversation we need to start having with Nigerians now is for people to understand that things, I mean, you get cheap electricity, but you have only 6 hours of it. Oh, I mean, how does that benefit you? Why not have cost-reflective tariffs and have power 24 hours a day? And then you can set up your small and medium enterprise. Every economic research tells you that at very low levels of income elasticity is extremely important. If you go to a rural area and there is no power, it doesn't matter how cheap it is. The person in the rural, he can't afford a generator, he can't afford diesel, he cannot set up an MSME. You give him power 24/7, he will find what to do to earn the income and pay for the power and build his resources and take his family out of poverty. So it's having that conversation for people to understand that people who say they're helping you are actually destroying your future. They're destroying the education of your children. They're taking away from you the opportunities to have power. Power is a factor of production. It's not a consumable. Okay, we think of power as something you use to watch Manchester United versus Arsenal, not something you use to build micro and small enterprise. That's why we panic when you talk about increase in the price of power, even though that increase is necessary for us to have the availability of this factor of production. Okay, so these are the kinds of conversations that we need to have. And they're difficult conversations, they're difficult decisions that will be taken, and Nigerians need to prepare themselves to accept that if we want to have a consensus. Now, the third point I'd like to talk about is we have lost a lot of ground that we had gained before. Okay, and here I'm referring to public servants that you would call unelected power. Okay, institutions that were set up to protect the system against the excesses of politicians which unfortunately have gotten co-opted into the political process. If you think in political theory, if you think of Antonio Gramsci, it's the co-option of the civil society into political society. Okay, you have a central bank that is supposed to have price stability and exchange rate stability as its mandate. And it is given independence and autonomy so that it can say no to politicians. You have a judiciary that's supposed to have justice, is given autonomy so it can say no to politicians. You have a police, you have anti-corruption agencies. These institutions have been built. Democracy is not just about voting, it's about the rule of law. Now, what happens if the police, the judiciary, the central bank, the civil service, if they now see themselves as part of a political process, as an arm of the ruling party, everything is gone. Okay, so we need to go back to that situation where politicians respect the independence and integrity and autonomy of these institutions, and where these institutions are held accountable by the law setting them up to do what they want to do. Why do we not have cost-reflective tariffs? We have a law. There is a law that says this is how you have tariffs. There is a regulatory agency whose commissioners were appointed on the basis of that law to implement the provisions of that law. It has not been done. Who is held accountable for that? So I hope that the next president will make a very clear statement that he's going to return institutions, respect these institutional arrangements, allow these institutions to do the work that they're supposed to do, and understand that these are not just places for patronage. You know, somebody has contested for House of Representatives, he has failed. You make him electricity commissioner, or you make him, these institutions are not for that, okay? They're there to protect people, but they're to be held accountable. You must have transparency. People must know what they're doing and be able to assess them against the mandate that they've been given. Now, the final point is, I think we talk about having a consensus among the elite. We may not have it, okay? Because there will be members of the elite that will never go for a consensus because they look at their interests. They've got vested interests. You can't wait until everybody agrees. We take these decisions, we need to communicate them to the people, and so long as they're doing the right thing, we all have a duty to help Nigerians understand that we have to make these sacrifices in the short term for us to have long-term sustainability. If we don't take these decisions from May 29, in 2 years, they'll be preparing for 2027 elections, and it will become more difficult. So difficult as it is, what I really would like to see is May 29th or the next day, I would like to see the list of ministers. I have seen a list of ministers in Nigeria, 36 ministers without a single economist. And that cabinet ran for 4 years, not one economist, which means every day in Federal Executive Council, there isn't one economist in there. In a time of a global economic crisis, how do you expect your economy to go forward? Okay, so we'd like to see who is the finance minister, who is the governor of central bank, who is the planning minister, who is the trade and investment minister. We've talked about ambassadors, and people underestimate the role of ambassadors. You see, I have been to countries and I've seen the people we have sent to represent us, and I've gone, really? And I'm talking about global capitals in the world. And if that person sits with investors, after 5 minutes, he says, I'm not coming to that country. So we've got to look at who is appointed, what are the key decisions that are taken, and then when the money is freed up, what is the policy direction? I wish this country the best. I think at this time we need a lot of good luck and a lot of prayer and a lot of effort, but we have to make sure we put in everything we need to move forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Khalifa. Khalifa, you've given me headlines anyway, so don't worry about it.
Just for the journalists, please remember that this is the panel. I do not want my name as a headline.
Okay, let's have the next intervention from the immediate past governor of Ekiti State, Dr. Kayode Fayemi. Please, oh, okay. Doctor, you can also...
No, that's Khalifa's seat. It's not meant for plebeians. Thank you, Nancy. Well, let me also join others in commending Zainab for this excellent work. Zainab and I have also been engaged in this intellectual jousting since our days in Oxford. And then, of course, when she moved to the US, to Carnegie, I've also followed her trajectory closely, and I'm immensely proud of the great work she's doing at Carnegie right now. Really, Nancy, there's very little to add to the profound remarks that have been made by all the panelists, right from our brother, the newest politician, Charles Soludo, to the accidental politician, and then the public policy guru these days, Haig, and of course, Shubham and His Highness. But I would just like to maybe highlight a few things they've said and look at it differently. Yes, we need to study that period where we witnessed episodic growth. The government that Madam Nasri was part of, that Charles was part of, and we had a lot of excellent people in. But I think what political science also teaches is that the nature of transition itself will be responsible for whether we get transformational leadership or we get mere political reconfiguration. And that's the reason why President Obasanjo was not able to do that in his first term. He had ministers that were the products of the pact that produced him in 1999. But he gained a lot more wiggle room in 2003 to bring in the type of people that he felt would help him deliver the goods. And he pretty much succeeded on that count. So what am I saying? As much as Khalifa is keen for us to do a magical turnaround on May 29, and we will try. I'm using we, the royal we now, Your Highness, as a floor member of the victorious party in that election. But I would also say that it's clear that the nature of this transition is going to affect whatever the outcome is when we get to office. Because until Nigeria realizes that a winner-takes-all political structure is not going to give us the kind of settlement that will produce tough decisions that we want to see, I don't think we're going to get there. For me, we're still along the journey of political alternatives. We have not yet reached alternative politics yet. When we reach alternative politics, then we will be able to deal with all these issues, because competence is great. And we got competent ministers in that period that we talked about. But what made competent ministers deliver on the goods was not so much that. Malamasi said something. He said we didn't have to worry about the politics. President Obasanjo handled the politics for us. So you can be competent, you can be committed, you can be compassionate, but if you're lacking in courage in politics to take the tough, unpopular decisions, we're not going to get anywhere. So I think we need to add courage to that line of attributes that Malam Nasru spoke about. And Charles spoke about that section in our manifesto. I laughed because I recall the section very well. Malam Nasru too will recall it. I actually wrote it. I wrote that particular section that Charles referred to. Waziri played some part in it. He will know, he's not a member of our party, but he will know the part he played in it. But the very first week we got into government, a spokesperson of our own government, our own administration, immediately denounced and denied that entire manifesto and said, well, we don't know where they got this from. It was a mere shopping list. So that tells you that consensus takes various dimensions. And it wasn't a surprise to some of us that the work that Malam Nasri then went on to do with our political restructuring committee, which produced excellent proposals for devolution and also even produced bills for the parliament to use in achieving that purpose, ended up dead in the water. And we can attribute that to so many reasons. But I do think it's important that we understand that if we're going to build a better, competent, more organized country, it has to be a coalition of the willing. And we need to bring every serious-minded people on board. I have been an advocate of a government of national competence, but a government of national competence that is also the product of our variegated political structures. So a government of national competence is not necessarily a negation of a government of national unity. It's how we arrive at it that will determine whether we achieve the purpose that we are all very keen to achieve with this exercise. And if we don't have that courage, you cannot get the resources required to begin the necessary transformation. I believe that if we're really serious and if we work assiduously at it, we can get annually $40 billion savings at the minimum from our current waste. Whether you take the 12 billion from the subsidy currently, and you take another 12 billion from the 455 barrels that is supposed to be refined that we don't know where it ends up, that's another 12 billion, and you do the tariff on electricity and the foreign exchange, you can, I mean, Shubham is here, they've done the numbers. We discuss these things at the Nigerian Governors Forum with them regularly. We have enough not to end up in the IMF basket if we're serious. But we need that courage to do that. And that is really what Zainab's conclusion is. It's, for me, a masterclass in political economy, what she's done. And if we take the prescription seriously and we achieve the political settlement that is necessary, then we may still escape Robert Kaplan's Armageddon that is almost upon us. I hope with competent but courageous leadership, we will be able to begin that journey. But it has to be a journey with maps. We've been on a journey without maps for a long time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Governor Fahimi. Just like Mr. Igboje said, perhaps we've been in a driverless car, you know. But at this time, let me gender balance. Mrs. Miriam Owais, for your special intervention. She's the special advisor to the President on social investment I also heard clearly when Dr. Usman was talking about the way social investments work here. When you were speaking, what came to my mind was the Brazilian model, Bolsa Familia, the way, they did their own social investment. So perhaps you can lend a voice to that.
Thank you so much.
Yes.
And I'm really impressed by Zainab. I never linked her with my Lord Justice Mira Usman. We're in university together. She was my senior. I'd like to congratulate them both. And of course, Zainab's dad. It has been a very interesting conversation for me. And I will just talk about the social sector. I think one of the hugest tragedies is the politicization of issues that really should not go into politics. And I think one of the things that I must commend the World Bank is having data is critical. And we've been able to build a social register that is, to a large extent, not subjective. But what we find is a lot of politicians and elected officials in particular wanting slots or wanting us to compromise the integrity of the data. And there's no way we can improve or do something targeted, strategic, without improving the data that we have. I'd like to speak in particular about what happens or what I've noticed in my few years of service in government. I noticed that elected officials, and in fact, even the private sector, want to see immediate returns on investment. And the reality is what we need to do in the social sector is over a period of time. So if there's 100 million, for instance, budgeted for education, the tendency is to focus on things that are tangible. So that is, in a 4-year term, what we look at is the buildings, the infrastructure. And I'm not saying infrastructure is not important. We don't have nearly enough. But in the process, we've allowed other issues that are just as critical to slip through the cracks. So you can build the finest school in a poor community. If you don't address the social protection issues, the children will still go to the farm and the children will still go and hawk. If you don't address the security issues, you don't address, the competence and the quality of teaching, what happens in the classroom is not going to be encouraging for children that are out of school. So we need to begin to measure and monitor and place a lot of premium on these social protection issues to ensure that they are as important. We must apply funds to that sector and keep close monitoring of what happens so that even if it takes 3 or 4 years for us to have results that we can point to as our legacy, we will do so. So I don't know whether it's the 4-year structure that's the problem, because the intangibles are not as important or are not prioritized, and this for me is critical. So, I mean, even though I know we have a huge debt, burden, maybe bonds, social bonds or gender bonds, those bonds, because you are compelled to monitor them closely and you don't need the results like yesterday, you don't need to see a building, in 6 months. This is the problem. I think the quality also of leadership, not just at federal, at state level, our chairmen at local governments, we must begin to work out how we can ensure that they understand what the challenges are. You just throw your hands up in despair sometimes when you engage them on a lot of these issues, because there is no way we can address poverty. And of course, the other thing is we tend to look just at education in a clinical manner without looking at the health as it affects education. I think we need to look at the whole to be able to address a lot of these challenges.
Okay, thank you very much, Mrs. Uwais. Yeah. His Highness Khalifa Mohammed Sanusi II has just sent his apologies that he has to leave now to catch a flight to Lagos on board an international flight today. So he has to leave us now. But what we need to do, we would have to conclude we have to get out of here within the next 20 minutes. So we are coming to the Q&A session now. We'll take a few questions from the audience, and our panelists will be answering them. Governor El-Rufai, you're still needed here, and Mr. Igboje Ayimokwede. If you want to ask your questions, please raise your hands. The ushers are there. Oh, I see a room filled with hands. Come on, guys, we've got to leave here. I will be taking, how many? Okay, we'll take 4 questions. Please, let's take 4 questions so that we can get out of here quickly. We've really taken so much time. Okay, let me start from this side of the room. Okay, oh, okay, you'll be giving the mic, Bashir. Okay, please stand, introduce yourself, and who your question is targeted at. Governor El-Rufai is not here. Shuban, please, you'll come back on stage in case there's a question for you. Governor El-Rufai. Okay, Bashir, yes.
They keep calling me Bashir. It's Barrister Ismail.
Ismail.
Good afternoon, everyone. I think my question also relates to, will be to Governor El-Rufai as well as Ike, but I'm just going to ask it anyways. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Ismail Ahmed. I work at the presidency. Yeah. Mr. Ike, my questions are very simple. It has to do with fuel subsidy. Is the imminent launch of the Dangote refinery in Lagos going to have a substantial effect on our decision to remove fuel subsidy immediately? That's my one question. Number 2, the insatiable demand for foreign exchange by Nigerians, either going to school, hospitals, and stuff like that, it's not going to dissipate anytime soon. What is the immediate solution to foreign exchange crisis? Not necessarily the systemic or the structural long term, that we have to stop importation, we have to stop going abroad, we have to build better schools. All those things are necessary. But what is the immediate realistic foreign exchange solution to this problem that we have right now? Thank you so much.
Okay, no, let's take all the questions, then the panelists would ask. I'll take one more. Please, the usher, can we go to the back, please? Is the mic? Can we go to the back of this way? Usher, please take it here. Take it still to this side of the room. Take it to the side of the room. Can we have it at the man at the back here isn't the... Yes. Please, yes. Introduce yourself very quickly, and please just make it short so that we can take all your questions.
Thank you. My name is Abel Gaya from Clean Tech Hub. Zainab, thank you for popularizing political settlements framework. My question to you, and maybe to Mr. Chaudhry as well, is to what extent can multilateral organizations like the World Bank and international partners help coalitions to be able to bypass disruptions and barriers to development reforms? I think El-Rufai under BP, the World Bank helped him with budgetary support to be able to bypass in its early years legislative or requests from the legislature for bribes, according to his book. So examples like that, to what extent is that feasible in Nigeria?
Okay, thank you. Let's come to this side of the room. Okay, I see a lady in front. Can we bring this mic to the lady here? And Professor Joe should please prepare. At the end of the questions, you will give us just a few your remarks in just a few minutes.
Okay. Dr. Zainab, congratulations on an excellent event. You're a true epitome of what it means to be a youth and a woman in Nigeria. I have 2 questions. My name is Shine Wanaka. I'm the co-founder and convener of Africa Policy Conversations and managing partner of the Firma Advisory. My first question is around what it means to be Nigerian. During this past election cycle, I think a lot of us really questioned what it meant to be Nigerian. And no matter how much we try to focus on the issues and the policies, most times you find that during the election cycle, it descends into tribe and religion. And I always say a house divided against itself cannot stand. So my question is, how do we heal Nigeria? How do we get everyone in Nigeria to feel like they're a stakeholder in order to, lead to that consensus we're talking about? The second question is about capacity and competence of people in government, the politicians and the policymakers. Whenever you go for events like this, it's the same people on stage, the same governors, and the same people, because they're the minority at the end of the day. We still have about 30 other governors who won't be called for events like this. So how do we replicate the people we have on stage? The people who know the solutions to the problem, the people who can really make a difference, especially on the state level, on the subnational level. So those are the two questions. How do we heal to be able to create that critical mass and the consensus that we talk about? And then how do we scale the capacity in the room so that this can be a reflection of what Nigerian leadership is all about? Thank you.
Who is that your question meant for? For who? Or anyone can answer. Okay, Governor El-Rufai. Okay. Let's take from the back, and I'm afraid that will be the last question. Please, don't also forget Professor Soludo is online. Professor Soludo is also online. Okay, please, your name and your question.
Good afternoon. My name is Chiamaka Okafo. I work for Premium Times. First is to say congratulations to Dr. Zainab Usman.
A few more. Okay. Yeah, please go ahead. Okay. Sorry.
So first is to congratulate Dr. Zainab Usman. Great presentation. Great stuff you have there. First question to you will be the case you made about intermediate states, developmental states, failed states. And at what point is it okay to refer to Nigeria as a failing state since we don't fit into any of the categories? To Governor El-Rufai, you spoke about political will and the arrangement of 1954, the regional government. And question there is, will the regional government then work at this point where it appears cohesion is almost, if not absent here in Nigeria? How do we ensure that we are not further divided along the various imaginary or unimaginary lines existing? Political class sanitation, I'm not sure who made that statement, but quick question to everyone perhaps is to say, at what point do we move from sanitation of the political class to sanitizing the Nigerian state and the Nigerian people? Because the leaders we produce are a reflection of who we are as a people. So this is a general food for thought, I guess. And restructuring, reconfiguring, reforming, and all those, very nice.
Your questions are multi-layered.
Yeah.
So just very quickly.
Apologies, Nancy.
Yes.
At what point, so for me, I would imagine a lot of us feel this way. Those words are becoming so painful to the ears because we hear them every day and then we don't see a practical reflection of what they are. So at what point do we start to do things like Botswana? I really like that a lot of examples were given around African countries, especially Kenya. For me, Kenya is important because I need to understand what is Kenya doing. I mean, Nigeria is the big brother, in quotes. So at what point do we move beyond, from idealism to realism? What do we have and what can we do with what we have? Thank you.
Okay, we can take other questions. Okay, can we come to the front? Usher, please bring the microphone. Okay.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry for intimidating. My name is Abdul Oro. I work for myself, Abdul Oro and Company, trying to imitate Mrs. Wiss. Yeah, my question is, El-Rufai is here, and I want to know what he thinks about Abuja now. There is no public transport system in Abuja. Well, there since you left. And you see potholes everywhere, filth everywhere, and abandoned projects, halfway done projects, and you can't get a CFO for a piece of land, even if you've paid for it. Those who paid for land and they have their CFOs, sometimes you get there, somebody else is building on it. Those appropriated for, or misappropriated for the Millennium Villages, is it Millennium City?
Millennium City.
They can't even go to court for redress. Now, I heard some people are saying everywhere that they should move El-Rufai to Chief of Staff or National Security Advisor. I want to recommend that we bring El-Rufai back to Abuja as Minister of Federal Capital Territory, so that you give us a 21st century city. Better than Rwanda, probably better than Dubai. That is one. Then two, well, I don't know why you put so much money at Oxford. No, should have brought that money to Edo State University or another university locally. And then what they are doing in Oxford, we do it here. Thank you very much. I called him my Boje because he's my brother. I should have said chief or doctor. Thank you very much.
That was not a question, actually. We are campaigning for Governor El-Rufai to be next minister. Okay. Can we take another question from the side of the room? Okay, I see. Let's take this one. The man with, I can see coffee brown cap from here with a white agbada. Then we'll come to this part of the room.
Thank you, Nancy.
Yeah.
All other protocol was observed. Dr. Zainab, congratulations once again. My name is Chiroma Ibrahim, a family friend to Dr. Zainab. We have discussed at length issues left, right, and center. Politics, fiscal, economy, whatever. The question is how Nigeria can build a post-oil economic future. It means oil that gives us more revenue has a problem. Over time, it will not give us revenue. If not at the presentation level, my expectation is at the discussion level, we should have come up with alternative sources of revenue without talking about taxes, subsidies, or in addition to talking about taxes, subsidies, and whatnot. Even if we have the best government, the best public service, whatever, if the source of revenue that we use to provide the subsidies is not improved, what is the way forward? I think this question is for the World Bank director here. Thank you very much.
Okay. So this side of the room. Okay, let's take him. Then we'll take the lady at the back, just directly at his back.
Thank you, Dr. Zainab, for your brilliant book on chapter 3. Actually, I have not finished the book. My question, I'm not sure who to direct it to, but maybe to Governor El-Rufai. And I agree with the last speaker, please. I know you don't repeat class, you said it before. I hope you come back as FCT minister. My question is, we talk about removal of subsidy, for example, and waste. I've not seen in the book or during these discussions what we are doing about effective utilization of resources. It's one thing to put the resources. We'll continue talking about revenue. Now, let's assume we even have the revenue. I've not seen those deep discussions about how we are going to have effective utilization of these resources, because in the last 8 years, they will tell us they have generated 10 trillion in taxes, they have generated from customs, they have increased revenue. What are we doing about effective utilization of resources, maybe for the next government? Thank you.
Okay. I think part of his question was answered, really, in terms of spending for health. The Khalifa mentioned it, Governor El-Rufai also mentioned it. But perhaps you need an elaborate one from the government you mean. Okay, the lady.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm not sure who to direct my question to, but I think Dr. Zainab.
Please take the mic closer. Yes.
Can you hear me better now? Oh, okay. So my question is...
Your name, please.
My name is Sauda Ahmed Boboy. I'm a renewable energy engineer. So my question is, would you say that there are different economic ideologies across Nigeria and that sort of affects how policy decisions are made? So in some regions, there's more of a sort of socialism, whereas in others there's a sort of capitalism, and there's a sort of disunity, and that perhaps affects whether subsidies are chosen rather than investment or supporting private enterprise, because there isn't that unified economic ideology. And do you think this is something that should be a focus, perhaps in research, identifying what unified ideology Nigeria should use? Or do you think, as Governor El-Rufai mentioned, there should be that different sort of regions having their own different ideologies?
Who is your question directed to?
Perhaps Dr. Zainab or Governor El-Rufai, or whoever feels they can answer best.
Okay, I think we'll come over to Professor Ogu. Let the panelists take the questions. And there's also a question for Professor Soludo. Is Professor Soludo still online? Studio? There's a question for him. Professor Soludo, I hope you're listening. That came from Kasim earlier, and he asked actually what the balance of power means, because Dr. Usman was talking about balance of power a lot. He is asking about, does it mean really the devolution of power to the federating units and how that will work? So that is for Professor Soludo. Professor Ojowu, please, can we just quickly take a few remarks, your comments very quickly before we come back to the panel for the answers. The mic.
Thank you very much, if you insist. Let me take you to the mundane. One of the things I'm proud about myself, beating my chest, is that I've trained many economists, including Khalifa, who just left. So anytime I feel like getting frustrated and I remember what it was like in ABU in the 70s and 80s, I still have renewed hope that this country will go on. But the mundane is this. I took over from Charles Olodo as head of the National Planning Commission. And Obasanjo directed us to redo the Planning Commission for effectiveness. And we spent a lot of time doing it. When we left, the pension to become a minister was so important that the commission was turned into a ministry. The head of the National Planning Commission that time had power under the vice chairman to summon ministers to discussion. But when we left, the head of the National Planning Commission was called a minister. And that was the end of the commission. Today, listen to the anomaly. There is a ministry called Federal Ministry of Finance, Budget and National Planning. So you budget to plan. That is the kind of challenge we are facing in this country. Meanwhile, the law established a National Planning Commission still subsists. So how are you going to get institutions to do the right thing? My young friend, El-Rufai, said people should have institutions to do the right thing. Right peg, square peg, and square hole. When the institutions are not made square where they should be square, where are you going to find the square to put it? See, states today are making progress on the personal will of a governor, not the institution. The governor has the right to collect money from the federation account once he becomes governor, but has no obligation to account for that money to anybody. There's no law. As soon as you collect that money right from the office, you can start dishing it out to anybody you choose to dish out to. So, in a sense, you say there's no consensus. Well, I still believe that there's a conspiracy consensus, where in many states they sit to share the money. That is a conspiracy. And the money is still being shared till tomorrow. While, in fact, if we want to transit resources from the federal government or the federation to the states, the capacity to absorb those resources and use them properly must also be in place. We do know, for example, that some states are doing better than others. But there's not a single state in this country that we know what its GDP is. So you cannot measure the growth of a state GDP. Those who know, they know so informally. There is a responsibility for the states to collaborate with the National Bureau of Statistics to formally develop the state-level GDPs.
Prof, we have state GDPs now.
I know that there are 22 of them as of moment. I'm aware of that.
Yes.
But they are not functional. That's what I'm saying. So we need to work on that to ensure that we do those things that enable each of the states to be held responsible for its growth and its diversity. We are not going to have a diversification if you don't have states acting in terms of policy. Somebody has just said that what are the sectors to generate revenue? We don't have any problem with diversification in terms of structure. The GDP, the MBS already identifies 45 different economic activities on which we calculate the GDP. But what it takes in each of these areas for us to understand formally that this is what the ratio of revenue generation in Kaduna to GDP is this. We need to work on these things to ensure that this clarity is data, and also to ensure that this kind of debates we are having is important. But what I see is that we are going to have a new government continue with the old problems. And I think we should stop that. We knew from the beginning, I worked with Abacha regime, there was no subsidy in fuel until maybe some 10 years ago. We don't need that subsidy now. On the 29th of May, let us face the crisis of removal subsidy. Let us die if we need to die.
All right, thank you very much, Prof. Prof was the former chief economic advisor to the president. Okay, so back to our panel. Mr. Aiboje, let's, I hope you remember your questions. The Dangote refinery from Ismail, which I think is a very fantastic question.
Okay, okay, thank you. Thank you for your, I think there was a question, or a speaker who had two questions.
Yeah.
One about, both with respect to FX, but one related to the Dangote refinery and fuel subsidy, and then directly FX. Let me start with the FX issue because it's quite simple. You alluded to what you defined as an FX challenge. And I guess you are speaking in the context of today, because it's not every time in the past 60 years that FX has challenged us in the way that is challenging us now. And that challenge manifests maybe in the availability and in the fact that the pricing of it is a bit complex. There are two issues around FX availability and FX pricing. One is just fundamental economics. Inflation and interest rates of a country will determine the rate at which its currency exchanges against the currencies of other countries. And particularly if you are talking about a G7 country like the US, so Naira to dollar. It's a bit like gravity, and unfortunately, it's almost impossible to legislate against gravity, okay? You can understand gravity and you can do certain things to manage gravity, but you can't command a stone that you drop, don't drop. It will drop unless you do certain things, that counter the law of gravity. So in our case, we have to go back to study those periods when FX was available, what type of FX regime from a monetary policy standpoint did we operate,
And let's look at our current circumstances and see if we can go back to that type of regime. Essentially, the most efficient way and effective way of pricing scarce commodities is markets. There are other ways, but the truth of the matter is that if it's a scarce commodity, to sustainably, manage it, I mean, you have to use some market-based solution. Now, on Dangote refinery, and your question was related to subsidy. Let me explain something, because I kind of understand the way the politics and economics of subsidy in Nigeria work. The decision to have fuel subsidies in Nigeria is not grounded in any economic thinking or basis. It's a purely political one. So, from an economic standpoint, you now have the ability to refine 650,000 barrels of crude per day, okay, in Nigeria, come the commissioning of that refinery. As to whether or not it is going to mean that you can, remove fuel subsidy, will be a question of, the first question is that will Nigeria give Dangote crude oil? At what price will Nigeria give Dangote crude oil? You begin to understand. So if you want to continue with subsidies, okay, the only way that the Dangote refinery is going to be able to, generate fuel at sub-international market prices if you give Dangote subsidized crude oil. Now, Dangote is not asking for subsidized crude oil. Neither are Nigerians asking for subsidized crude oil. All we want is supply the refinery, reduce the cost of transportation, okay, and let us produce the refined products here. It will drop actually the prices of petrol from a transportation standpoint, but I don't think it's going to affect the international price of crude oil nor the international price of landed petrol. I don't know if I've answered your question.
Okay. Governor El-Rufai, you also had some questions from the audience. I don't know if you could speak about the issue of Abuja. Quite also a lot of people were asking in terms of the consensus, what will it take to get the politicians to do right by the people, in summary? Yeah.
Well, thank you, Nancy. I'm sorry I stepped out to see my friend off, His Highness Khalifa, so I may have missed that question. This consensus is not something that you can achieve by getting people in a room and have a discussion and agree on anything. It doesn't work that way. I think that there are three components to getting there. First, we must recognize that it takes a long time to build a nation. Okay, you can create a country, but building a nation, getting people to put the nation first before their ethnicity or religion or something takes time and requires a lot of building of social capital. However, if one, you have a legitimate government, elected, legitimate, or unelected but legitimate. Two, that government communicates very clearly where it wants to take the country. Three, and also explains what it takes, what sacrifices are needed by everyone to get to that point. And three, you have a credible leader who can champion that messaging, that engagement, to sell his vision to the people and what sacrifices the people need to make to get there. Then you're on your way to building some kind of consensus. But as pointed out by my brother, His Highness, not everyone will agree. So at the end, you must have a strong leader who is willing to bulldoze his way through and get some things done, even when some people are kicking and screaming and resisting, because vested interests will always resist. trade unions will resist certain policies purely for ideological reasons. They think they are comrades, so they have to oppose something for the sake of it. Civil society get funding from countries. You know, some of them will fight on a point because that's the way they get funding, not because it makes sense or not because it's in the interest of the country, but because it gives them the right media attention so that they collect funds from their various. So you have to sit and look at all this and realize that there are some things that you just must push through, and then people will catch up. And over time, when people realize that, you know, you are trying to do the right thing, and then you have another legitimate government, strong leader, credible leader coming after you, that's how it is done. That's how it gets built up. Okay, we are at the bottom now. Social capital is almost zero. We are in trouble economically, and the work ahead for the next president of Nigeria is unbelievable. I don't envy Asiwaju Bola Ahmed Tinubu at all, and those that will have to do this work, because it has to be done. It has to be done. And along the lines, you know, we may get there. Now, the point that I've always made is credible people, smart people need to be in politics and public service. You have to make the sacrifice. Nancy is talking about 30,000 naira minimum. No, those are not the guys that drive the country. People at the top, okay, are those that drive the country. The 30,000 naira people, that's not where the problem is. But those that can leave their well-paid private sector jobs and come into government to be permanent secretaries, to be ministers, to be heads of agencies, to be directors, can begin to move this country in the right direction. The issue of what we pay public servants is a big conversation. Yeah. But we cannot pay them more than what we pay them now because of the numbers that we have. And I'm not sure we need up to 20% of the public servants we have working for the government to run the country. But that's a completely different conversation. It has to do with the size of the federal government, and this is why we are saying go back to the 1954 political arrangement. You need to reduce the size of the federal government. You need to reduce the number of people working for the federal government. You need to make the national government less attractive, even to the politicians. Okay? Now, there is another question, how to heal Nigeria.
Yes.
This, I have answered it in part, you know. There is a big job ahead for the next president. This job of healing, and it doesn't happen overnight. It takes time. And you earn the trust of people only through your actions, your words matching your actions. And then people see very clearly you are the president of all Nigeria. You are not favoring one section against the other. You are not favoring one religion against the other, because the level of suspicion now is very high. But within a year, all that can take the backseat depending on, one, the policies and vision that the president outlines and says, this is where I want to take the country, and I need you to do this, I need you to sacrifice this. Two, what His Highness said. Who are the members of the team? Are they square pegs in square holes and so on and so forth? The day Asiwaju announces his cabinet and his key aides, Nigerians will decide what to make of the government and whether they will support him to do this healing and rebuilding and so on and so forth. So it's very critical. Leadership, team, diversified team, and then, you know, you have to do the hard work of bringing everyone back together. But it starts with people saying, okay, these guys are good. They will take us where the president wants us to go. How do we have more competent political leaders? Good people must be interested in politics. You know, people in the private sector, civil society sector that are financially compatible need to come into public service and make the sacrifice. That's what some of us did. And we have no regrets. But I've done it for 20 years. It's time for some of you to now come and replace us. How do we go back to the political settlement of 1954? It's gradual. We are not saying, going back to the political settlement of 1954, we go back to 3 or 4 regions. No. It's impossible to close down these states. It's unfortunate that they have been created, honestly, because they have become so small. The reason why the regions were able to contain the excesses of the national government at the time was because they were big. They were humongous. But now the states are so tiny and so entirely dependent on the national government that they have no voice. So the 36 states are a fact of life. We are not saying go back to regions or whatever. But go back to the arrangement in which the 36 states collectively had 80% of the of national resources, national income. That was the 1963 Constitution. 80% of the national revenues of Nigeria went to the regions. If you give only 20% of federation revenues to the federal government, it has to slim down. It cannot afford all these 700 parastatals and agencies, some duplicating functions, some totally unnecessary, some just get budgets. Look, there is an agency called Utility Charges Commission. Have you ever heard of it? It has been in existence since the time of General Ibrahim Babangida. They get a budget every year. I don't even know if they have staff, but the money disappears. So there are many, look, it's because the money is there. If you reverse the revenue allocation formula and the federal government has only 20% and 80% goes to the states, and then you go to the exclusive list, revert to the 1963 Constitution's exclusive list, where the federal government has limited functions and most of the functions go to the states. Okay, and you sell this so that Nigerians understand. If your general hospital doesn't work, if your primary school doesn't work, if your secondary school don't work, it has nothing to do with the president. Ask your governor. Okay? Then things will begin to change. Then the states will have enough resources to be viable. The states will begin to compete, as we saw the regions competing, and so on and so forth. What do I think of Abuja? I don't think of Abuja. I don't think about it. I have done my job. I'm done. I don't look back. In fact, when I left FCT, the only time I visited FCT was in 2016, when my classmate, my secondary school classmate, was appointed the minister, and he said he wanted to see me. So I went there. Once I leave a job, I don't look back. I leave Kaduna in 19 days. I will only visit if it becomes necessary. So I don't think about the FCT. I've done my bit. I don't comment on the performance of those that came after me. I wished Dr. Ali Modibo was here because he was my immediate predecessor. So he explains to you why we don't have a public transport system in Abuja, because in my time we had. But ask him why he killed it. Only because it's called El Rufai bus, El Rufai taxi, that's all. He's my friend. He left quickly. I would have directed the question to him. Okay? So, even if offered, I'm not coming to Abuja again. As I say, I never repeat class. And there are many young people I know that I can recommend that will do an even better job than I did as Minister of FCT. I'm 63. I'm too old for this. I'm too old for demolition and so on and so forth. Get a young man with blood in his veins, or young woman. There was a question asked about what do we do with the revenues, extra revenues of subsidy. I think, as Nancy said, that has been answered. But let me tell you a story. Between September and November 2021, the National Economic Council gave us an assignment to work out what to do if we withdraw subsidy, how much will be raised, and so on and so forth. And we worked with experts, we worked with the World Bank. I chaired the committee that did that job. And we came out with a report, what to do with the resources, okay? Which will be transparently explained to Nigerians, Components of it include investment in security, investments in social protection, and so on and so forth. The report is there. And there is a framework what to do with it. And release more money for health, education, infrastructure, and so on and so forth. You know, many people don't understand that in 2021, the budget of the federal government for roads was 200 billion. And in 2021, we were projecting to spend, if I remember correctly, Shubham, was projecting to spend 1.2 trillion on subsidy. That's when it started. And we saw the danger, 1.2 trillion. And I remember when I went to brief the president on the report, I said, Mr. President, does it make sense to you for us to spend 200 billion on all federal roads in Nigeria in 1 year and 6 times that on cheap petrol? He said it doesn't make sense. I said, so why are we doing it? Okay, so this was something that we've been studying for many years, and we had a framework, and the Economic Council agreed. Okay, all the 36 governors of Nigeria agreed it should be withdrawn, and we had a clear plan. This is where the money will go. Some of it will go to federal government, some will go to states, some to local government, some to some interventions. We all agreed. The president said no. That's it. Now we are looking at what? How many trillion this year? 6 trillion. 6 trillion. And go and check what is the national budget for health, for education, for infrastructure. It's not up to that. It doesn't make any sense. So we need to explain this and end this subsidy thing. There was another question about whether we have a unified economic ideology. I don't know how to answer that because I don't believe in ideologies. Ideologies don't put food on the table. You know, every country, every society has its history, its context, and its problems. And I think you should just be sensible and pragmatic about solutions to your problems. If capitalist policy will solve your problem, take it. If a socialist policy will solve another problem, borrow from it. The solution to people's world's problems is to be pragmatic, not to be stuck in one ideological corner or another. Okay? Deng Xiaoping said, you know, who cares if a cat is black or white, so long as it catches mice? And I think that's the most sensible approach. So I'm not sure the issue about subsidy has to do with ideology. Most of the people that push ideology are actually hypocrites, these comrades that once they get money, they commit class suicide. Professor Ojo, you know, we have state GDPs. Mm-hmm. I know the GDP of my state, and we measure our GDP every year, and we work with National Bureau of Statistics. And believe it or not, you know, my state has been experiencing double-digit growth of its GDP. But of course, by the time it goes, even the year Nigeria went into recession, we grew 9%. But Nigeria's GDP was negative. So we do measure GDP state by state, and we know the state-level GDPs. So it's not quite correct. I think I've answered all my questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Governor El-Rufai. You know, Governor El-Rufai, anytime we'll meet, we're always like, you know, almost locking heads with questions, but that will be on another day on issues around public and civil service. When you said it will be nice for people that are financially comfortable to come into politics. When Mr. Igboje come into politics, is the political system now, is there an incentive for people in the private sector to come into politics? Is there, for example, a PAMSEC there now? Or, yeah, a PAMSEC, how much does a PAMSEC earn? How much does a retired judge earn to send his children to school? But people like you that are governors, when you're going, you have severance packages, you have houses in Abuja you're being given, and all of that, and you're telling people to make sacrifices, you know? So, look, I don't know if you want to respond to that very quickly.
I will respond to that. Look, let me tell you. People like Ike should be in politics. Okay? But there are many levels you can be in politics. Being in politics doesn't mean you contest elections. You can just sit at the table when decisions are being made to pick who is going to represent you. You will improve the quality. Okay? But when I say you are comfortable, I mean that you don't even need the pay. You don't need the severance benefit. And for your information, you know, maybe some governors have houses in Abuja. My state doesn't give me a house in Abuja or anything like that. These states vary. We are not all River State or Delta State, okay? Some of us are poor states. We don't have that. But what I'm saying is, if you're in the private sector and you have met your basic financial needs, you have your own house, you have this, you have, you know, come to the public service and contribute so that you turn around your country. Otherwise, whatever you think you have in the private sector can be destroyed by a consistently bad government. Okay. It's a matter of time.
Okay.
Okay, this is all I'm saying. Now, farm secs are very well paid. I'm not talking, you know, that's not where you should worry about. They take care of themselves. Okay?
How?
But if good people that have an independent mind and a voice, that is people that can stand up and say we must do the right thing and nobody can intimidate you, are not in government, please do not complain that things are not working well. And do not complain when you wake up one morning, all your money has been wiped out, or a government says, take your money to the bank. We are doing currency redesign. And they keep it and say, we are not giving you. Don't complain, because that's what you get when you allow scumbags to be in government.
Okay. Mr. Igboni,
Our debate continues.
Because I saw, do you want to respond to that, or would you have 100 million naira to buy a farm, for example? Because that's what the governor was saying, be financially comfortable. We will not live here.
Listen, Nancy, you said, what is the incentive for people to come? There is no incentive. You're fighting for the soul of your country.
With 100 million naira for
you think the politicians want you to come? They will try to discourage you. They will frustrate you.
Okay, let's get Mr. Igboje's comment. Yeah.
This question was asked of our second Agimokore Foundation fellow at Oxford.
Okay.
She was the past.
Give too much money to Oxford or something?
Yes,
No, I'll answer. I'll answer that. But no. So she was asked this question. Past Chief Justice of Ghana, Georgina Wood, I think. Georgina, I can't remember her. Georgina Wood. Yes. So she said, look, people go to public service first to serve. And that answer was very profound. All over the world, the primary motivation for working in government is a desire to serve. It is like, almost like those who work in medicine, the field of medicine, they take an oath. So people who are public servants or priests, they are a special breed. Unfortunately, however, we have disconnected the notion of public service from the Nigerian populace, not just the public servant, okay? So, even if you pay the public servant hundreds of millions of naira, if they don't want to serve, you will not get service. You can pay a banker a salary and motivate them to serve, okay? But in public service, I want you to understand that with the power of the pen of the public servant can kill or keep alive. That is the power. I'm saying that is literally the power. I'm not talking of a PEMSEC now. I'm saying even a clerk. That type of power only goes to those who want to serve. Otherwise, you will always have perverted outcomes.
Okay. Okay, Dr. Usman, Professor Soludo, do we still have him on for the question around balance of power? Prof? Okay, Prof.
Yes, you do.
Yes. Sorry for the hiatus a bit. Balance of power question.
Thank you. Yes? Nancy, are you hearing me?
Yes, Prof. I can hear you.
Yes,
sir.
Okay. What's your question?
The balance of power. there was a question for you. What does balance of power mean? Does it really mean the devolution of powers to the federating units, and what would it look like?
Well, balance of power, I mean, is quite an omnibus concept. You can use it everywhere. Balance of power between the government and the private sector, balance of power between community and communities, or inter-ethnic, inter-regional, and so on. But I think for purposes of national conversation and the kind that we're having today, the balance of power that we're talking about will relate to devolution of powers and financing, intergovernmental power and fiscal relationships. And then thinking about even the structure, the meaning and definition of our federation. Nigeria, in my view, is the only country, the only federal structure in the world that I know that has got 3 federating units. It's got the center, you have the states, which are supposed to be federating units. And then you also stay at the center, also legislate about what the local government system would be. That's an anomaly. And I think the El-Rufai committee recommended the abrogation of the local government system. The good news, I mean, for me, actually, is that the president-elect, I remember when we were at the Economic Council, he was the governor, he was then governor of Lagos State. And every time he attended the council, he spent time on almost on every subject, giving us a lecture about the distinction between the federation and federal government. You talk about accountant general of the federation, he would object that that is an accountant general for the federal government. If it is for the federation, he will be appointed by the federation, the federal government, and the states. The attorney general of the federation, he said no, it's the attorney general of the federal government, and so on. And he created the local governments or development areas in Lagos, which became an issue with the federal government then. I think some of these things are the areas that we need to begin to get on. And I think El-Rufai Governor El-Rufai has related this very succinctly. This issue is that the federal government is an octopus now. Huge bureaucracy. Hundreds, if not now, nearing 1,000 of parastatals and agencies and so on, gulping the entire revenues of the place. And the attempt to want to run the country from Abuja is what is wrong. In a federal structure, we must begin to think about delivery mechanisms and pay a lot of attention. Part of this power balancing thing is to take deliberate steps to incentivize the growth of institutions from below. Why should you? I mean, I listened to a dear friend, admired friend, Mrs. Uwais, talking about the social programs and so on. And that's one thing I commend the initiative when I was at the Presidential Economic Advisory Council. Great initiative. But with all due respect, my view is that it's poorly delivered. Because the attempt again to want to deliver to social people, you want to deliver to the poor person, needing person in my village from Abuja. No, it won't work. And so the states and the government, federal government, start on this playing games. That social register that you guys have, with all due respect, we know how they are put together. So you've got to devolve powers and financing. Get back, as Malam El-Rufai said, get back to that huge list on the exclusive legislative list and the concurrent legislative list. Let's get back. This is one area where I believe that our future lies in our past. It's one area where our future lies in our past. Let's get back. There was a time when it worked. Not the 3 regions or 4 regions of the past, but we can go back to I've written quite a whole lot when I was writing back page of this day. I wrote part 1, part 2, part 3, and even part 4 on this subject, that unless we get the structure right in terms of this devolution and power relationships, we're going to continue to want to do more with the Abuja bureaucracy that doesn't get to anywhere. And now sitting here, I've sat in Abuja there, I'm now sitting at the other end, but I kept arguing then that we were very inefficient, very, very inefficient, and would never deliver the goods. But I think I'm very glad that the president-elect is one that believes in this, in true federalism, because he was the lecturer to all of us on this subject. And I'm just praying and hoping that he will lead the way to walk the talk on this matter, because it's so fundamental to our next step to sustainability.
Thank you very much, Prof. Okay, Shubham, the question for you around alternatives to, what we're suffering right now. Are there really alternatives for us to get out? What are the hard decisions? I don't know if you have anything to add to that concerning the question around revenue challenges and, yeah.
So thank you, Nancy. I think there was one specific question about what role MDBs, came from the back of the room, can play in basically unlocking some of the constraints to the entrepreneurial and kind of business potential of Nigerians. So on that, let me just say, and then this relates also to the discussion we've just been having about, federal fiscal, whether it's fiscal or other devolution of responsibilities and roles. We've actually worked very closely with both the federal government and the states, and Governors El Rufai and Saludo know this very well, in helping support a program whereby the federal government provides a framework for which states deliver and states are incentivized to deliver. So it's a program for results, whether it's on fiscal management or whether it's on the business enabling environment. And from my interactions with all the governors, it seems that this is something that seems to have some potential. This kind of structure where there's a common framework, a common understanding of states have to deliver. States are responsible for most of what matters for Nigeria's firms, businesses, people. But states are also varied, so there needs to be some sort of common structure for incentivizing states and also getting a virtuous competition cycle or even peer learning. This was true in Indonesia, that was true in India, and I do think that is where the future of Nigeria is, and we have been supporting it through these program for results financing. On alternative, where would revenues come from? Where would the growth come from in the absence of oil? I think there are so many areas. This actually is also something else that we've been working with the states. Property taxes. Just states have tremendous potential to raise revenues, IGR, internally generated revenues from property taxes. Personal income tax, even corporate income tax, the base can be broadened, I think, as Governor El Rufai and others have mentioned. So this all comes from unlocking the space for private businesses to flourish. And there are certain sectors we can talk about, creative industries, IT-related, telecom, obviously, agribusiness, where if that potential can be unleashed, that itself becomes the tax base for non-oil revenues.
Thank you very much, Dr. Shubham. I'm afraid we have to come to the end of this right now because I see a lot more people want to ask questions, but please, you can email your questions. You can get across to Dr. Zainab Usman. You can get across to the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace as well as Agora Policy. Please, we just have to go. Can you really give this eminent, esteemed, high-level panel a round of applause for not just the quality of brain-stimulating conversation, but also the time and the sacrifice to sit down here and digging it out, as it were, speaking about Nigeria's problems, the challenges, and the solutions. Thank you very much, Governor El Rufai. We are still friends. Thank you very much, Professor Chukwuma Soludo, Governor of Anambra State. Thank you very much, Dr. Shubham Shaduri, as always. Thank you very much, Mr. Aiboje Imokwede, at least for bringing in a kind of fresh eyes into this, because you always have this kind of panel, you just see only the politicians there. So thank you very much for the fresh lens. Thank you very much, Dr. Zainab Usman, too, for giving us the background, to speak about this. Thank you. And such a fantastic audience. Please give yourselves a round of applause for sticking by and even wanted to ask questions, but we've got to go. At this time, let me invite Mr. Waziri Adio, the founder of Agora Policy, for the vote of thanks. For those of us on the panel, we're still going to stick here because we're going to take pictures immediately after the vote of thanks. So over to you, Mr. Adio.
Thank you very much, Chief Nancy Nagy. I think you have given a vote of thanks already, and the time is well spent. But let me just echo what you have said. First, I want to start with our panelists. I know that people made a lot of sacrifice to be here today. Governor El-Rufai had to reschedule his flight. Mr. Agboje, is in between different countries. Dr. Shaduri is always with us all the time. Professor Soludo also. So I'm very, very personally very grateful for being here and for the quality of your contribution. So thank you. Can we give the panelists another round of applause? And also Dr. Zainab Usman for doing this wonderful book that provided the platform to discuss this, and to our wonderful moderator also, and esteemed members of the audience. Some of people sitting down here might not know that the gallery is also full. At the last count, we had more than 200 people. I've been doing events in this hall in 2005, and it's not always that you find it like that. And this also goes to show that when people tell you that people do not talk about policy, people do not like talking about ideas, that is not true. It depends. So we need to continuously push the button and continue to work on finding solutions to the problem of our country. I also want to thank the people that put all of this together. There's a saying, that communism is very nice, but it costs so many nights, right? A lot of planning went into this. The Agora team, the Carnegie team, people have been on this for like the past 2 months. So when you see everything coming together, and myself here standing and taking all the glory, there are people who did all the heavy lifting. Can we also please put our hands together for the people who made this to happen? Kyla, Juliet, Faith, Ifetayo, David, Miriam, and the wonderful people from Yar'Adua Centre. They made this possible for us. So I want to thank everyone for finding the time to come here and for being present. You can be here and be doing some other things, right? And also the people that joined us virtually. I want to end by saying that nation building is a continuous conversation. Not a conversation that you can finish at one go, but it's a conversation that must continue. So please, let's continue this conversation. We don't have any other country. Some of us might not be as old as people like Governor El-Rufai, but our options are limited. We don't have any other country, but we don't have any other option but to make it work. And if what we can do from our own standpoint is to contribute ideas for others, or to co-source ideas, please let's do whatever we need to. People who need to make sacrifice, who need to put their money in, people who need to put their livelihood on hold, and people who need to support in other ways. Let's continue to think that if we build a better country, no matter our station in life, is for the collective good. Thank you so much. God bless. Thank you.